Hey y'all, thanks for joining me on this podcast. This is an archived episode podcast. I've got 20 stories for you for a long podcast. I am very busy this week and I just didn't have time to record anything. Next week I'm going to do a live. I haven't done a live in like 2 years. The main reason is because I can't get my computer to do it anymore. I don't know what's going on with my computer. I've got a new computer, I just haven't set it up yet. Anyway, I'm going to do a live from my phone and kind of talk to you guys about what's going on with the channel, what my plans are, what's happened to me over the summer regarding my work, and I was going to retire, I didn't retire. I'm going to explain all that to you. And I'll give you an update on Steve Lilly. Steve Lilly's not gone. Talk to you about ads. I'll talk to you about what I'm trying to do with that. Other places that I'm uploading podcasts that you're not even hearing on YouTube. I'm going to give you where you can hear those if you're interested. So I'm going to shut up. Everybody's here for the stories, but I'll do a live. The reason I'm doing a live is because 3/4 of the people don't even click on lives, but I figured I would do that and not make these story podcasts all filled with me running my mouth. I'll put a notification up for the live at some point, maybe this weekend when I'm going to do it. And if you want to hear what's going on, you can tune in. But I appreciate all y'all. It's Halloween tomorrow. Hope you have a happy Halloween. Have a great Thanksgiving coming up, and I'll see you on a podcast next week. I really appreciate you. All right, here we go. 20 stories. I'm sure to be nearing the end of my days on earth and surely soon to meet my maker. I will not lie about that. And lying was never my habit. I can shoot the bull, but I'm well known to be an overly serious type person. I'm just a bit strange. I am by birth a Texas native. I have 2 roll numbers in the Cherokee tribe and descended from a Scottish blacksmith indentured servant who came early to America and later became wealthy. I was a mere weed, yet I can truly claim great roots, but many burnt leaves. My family fought our British brothers and on both sides of our Civil War. And I am second cousin to the man in black, Mr. Johnny Cash. I'm grateful and proud, an unashamed Southerner and a proud American. I was also a military brat and later a Navy veteran. Being a military child, I was raised for 11 and a half years in the shadow of SAC, the former Strategic Air Command. I volunteered right out of high school and joined the Navy, which should have been a career move but turned out to be rather abbreviated. As that U.S. Air Force brat, I have an interesting and true story of a SAC nuke base that was commandeered in 1952 by the things that we call UFOs. It changed a lot of people's minds and thinkings, but I will get to that at the end of my letter. For 9 years, I lived in the Pacific Northwest and certainly loved it. Times were tough, but I was able to be employed with the U.S. Forestry Service during part of that sojourn. I was young. I knew many government forestry personnel, landowners, loggers, hunters, and fishermen, and a lot of them had personal testimonies of Bigfoot. So does the U.S. Air Force Survival School in Northeast Washington State. Personally, I spent every free moment I could get in those forested mountains and trudged up and down them carrying land surveying equipment and personal gear. For better or worse, while I certainly had my own share of harrowing adventures and scares, I not once encountered a Sasquatch, even though living actively right in the middle of their habitat, and I didn't have a clue as to them being any more than folklore. I ended up back down south during the toughest of economic times and in a sad and unfulfilled state of mind, and with very empty pockets. I had also just lost everything that I had gained in the Northwest. Twice now I have had the pleasure to return to Arkansas to live. Presently I live in Northwest Arkansas. Decades ago, I had a few acres of woods adjoining the Ouachita National Forest in Montgomery County, west of Hot Springs. It is right across the highway from the lake of the same name. That would be Lake Ouachita. It didn't take long, though, to discover the real reason why the former owner, a retired Social Security judge, gave me such a great deal on this land. He even threw in a decent boat, motor, and trailer in trade for me doing the survey. He and his wife just wanted to get it sold. Perhaps the missus couldn't tolerate the woods. Some city folk are bothered by that. They were not ever going to live there again. They moved back to the city, and I soon learned why. The judge and the missus had a well on the property, but it was awful. It was greasy water, almost unusable. Mobile homes are not such bad choices for a dwelling, as long as you don't stick it in a park with 1,000 other such contraptions. The electromagnetic attraction or the collection of weirdos in them may be too much for a tornado to resist. I suspect tornadoes are under some degree of control by normally unseen forces. That is what makes me a bit of a weirdo. Hey man, don't talk about the trailer parks. You mess with me, you messing with the whole trailer park. On the back of this house, the judge had had a nice deck installed. He even planned to have a rock garden. Rocks are about the only thing that will grow in that bit of red clay, and is continually producing chunks of quartz that just works up out of the ground despite gravity, and is surely the result of the Earth's rotation. Maybe. Or perhaps it was the aluminum roof on the mobile home. It created a sort of hell since he had located it hanging over a hill, but under one gigantic old oak tree. That tree produced the largest acorns I've ever seen, and a lot of them. Acorns drop from oak trees, this one in profusion. Sleep was not easily obtained. Worse, the area has or had an odd propensity to echo the slightest sounds. A seasoned 1-pound acorn falling on a metal roof from near 70 feet produces a loud bang. A continuous barrage produces a resounding din of racket. One could go insane from that alone. Perhaps that was enough to make anyone sell out fast and to make such a sweet deal to the unknowing buyer. They had that decent old bass and ski boat, though. They could at least go fishing often across the highway in Lake Ouachita. And there were the deer and the squirrels. It was a hunting and fishing heaven, but I heard they spent an inordinate amount of time away from the property. To be candid, after I bought it, so did I. In order to make the payments, and as there were few jobs that I could take locally, I went into long-haul trucking. I got to be home for a couple of days every 3 weeks. What a lonely occupation. Still, it paid the bills and provided a home for my ailing and aged parents, who at first thought it was a genuine godsend. We all thought so briefly, and we tried to make it a home. Soon, my only siblings showed up and presumed to help out and keep an eye on them. I got to use my bedroom, which overhung the hill, only occasionally, but for several reasons, huge acorns and being addicted to diesel vibrations, I slept often in my truck sleeper, even though I was home. I knew of the large numbers of deer in the area, as well as the usual small bear, cougar, bobcats, etc. Yet on the 2 trails that ran the length of the property, below and on either side of the hill, I seldom found deer tracks, or any other tracks for that matter, but they showed what I thought was some kind of heavy use. Hard clay and rock. Not the best sort of ground for detecting the sort of game that used it. I passed it off as a minor mystery, unworthy of much thought, which proved to be my mistake. My plot of dirt and rocks was heavily wooded with pines, dogwood, and large oaks. Dead leaves were a problem in the yard area. The trees certainly bothered my elderly mother, and they bothered my dad for entirely different reasons. She and my brother were persuaded by a local lumberman in my absence that the pine beetle had begun destroying my pines. She was promised an undisclosed amount of money and the promise to clean up all of the mess of slash left behind. I note that it was not her decision to make, but I had no idea of the denuded property until I drove in one weekend. Lots of oaks and dogwoods remained, but the pines were gone. I was enraged, but what could I do? Nothing. And the slash from the logging was later cleaned up by myself, my old father, and my brother. The pines went into furniture frames. They were gone, and I was sick about it. I had noticed every warm night on the weekends that I was home and I slept with my windows wide open, that I would be awakened around 11 p.m. by a quiet giggling or baby talk sound seeming to come from either side of the hill, but moving from the U.S. Forest Service area down towards Lake Ouachita across the highway. Strange enough, I thought, but I had no idea what to think and oddly thought it was some unknown behavior of other wildlife, probably deer. I don't know why I assumed that. I observed that the unusual and mysterious sounds could be followed beyond my hearing, tracing them by the barking and baying of distant neighbors' dogs. I knew the area well enough that those deer, it's okay to laugh at my deer theory, were going down to the lake to drink and or bathe. Sure enough, the distant barking would resume around 2 a.m., and I could trace their progress back towards my place, back up the trails, and again toward and into the Ouachita National Forest. My father liked to rise early and retire around sunset with a glass of iced tea out on the deck. Often we would sit and chat about nothing and the work that we had all done that day. Several times, however, he'd remarked about how he thought he was being spied on by a big, hairy, camouflaged neighbor hiding behind the trees out past our property lines. And sure enough, one evening I thought, too, that I saw the fellow. Sometimes he would sway left to right, but usually he seemed to peer from behind the trees. Once I walked out there with my rifle, hoping to have a more friendly encounter with the shy, strange visitor, but he would seem to melt into the forest before I arrived to where he or it was. By then, I was totally unsure of my old pop's vision and sanity, but wrote it off as my father's imagination. This, too, was a mistake. My brother, who occupied a 16-foot travel trailer out by the Forest Service line, was, however, terrified. He seldom spoke of it, but had begun to keep his rifle at the ready and claimed that someone was pounding on and jarring his trailer at night, sometimes scratching on the walls. He later built a large fire pit and began keeping a large fire all night, almost every night. He was a heavy drinker, though, and I chalked it up to his being a drunk. This assumption was also a mistake. One warm night with a full moon in 1991, I laid in my room with the windows open. Sleep was difficult due to the bombardment of acorns on the roof. We were exhausted from cleaning up the logging slash left behind by the crooked logger. I must have been leery about something because I was sleeping with my loaded .357 Magnum under the sheets on the pillow next to me along with our three-legged orphaned tomcat. Oh, the things that can happen on a full moonlit night. Unfortunately, until I recently learned of nasal strips, I had a monstrous snoring problem. I could rattle the windows. How anyone or anything could sleep near me was a mystery in itself, but that night, that strange cat had decided to sleep right next to me. I don't remember the actual time, but it was late. The old tomcat awoke me with a terrified caterwaul like I had never heard. He was arched up like a Halloween cat and his tail was fully bushed out in sheer terror. And as he was screaming at the door, he was also hosing a horrible-smelling stream of something onto my pillow. The cat was in a state of fear unlike anything I had ever seen. I looked at the door, which had a 1-foot square window, and simultaneously reached for and cocked my revolver. Filling that window was the biggest, hairiest man I had ever seen. I drew a bead on his head. I was scared, and I was pulling the trigger, about to send a hollow-point bullet blasting through that window right into the face of that creature, which by then I knew from its moonlit features was merely holding a near-human but huge hand to its face in an attempt to see just what in the hell was making that god-awful noise inside that metal house. Mere seconds passed as this encounter transpired, perhaps split seconds. The creature surely realized it was in trouble. It threw up its extra long arms as it turned and ran, screaming, very ape-like, flailing its arms and running for the Forest Service woods. I could see this creature quite well in the light of the full moon. In retrospect, I'm glad to not have shot it. It was as terrified as me and the three-legged cat, which had continued squalling and bolted screaming from the room, still hosing down its full path with that ungodly-smelling liquid. It took days of hard cleaning to remove that odor. There are a few things that I am certain of. The creature was screaming in fear as he ran from danger. However, I'm positive he was cursing me for all that he was worth. The logging slash he had run through was more than likely unpleasant and aggravated him even more. Before the erroneous logging operations, they were familiar with the woods of my newly acquired property. At that moment, he had no time to be careful, he just had to go. What I experienced that night was a huge, humanoid, bipedal, hairy ape man, one who was certainly capable of animal and human-like thinking. I finally realized why the old Social Security judge was so eager to sell out. It was all very clear at that point. The creature was roughly 9 to 12 feet tall, likely weighing in at 800 pounds. Long, stringy, dark hair covered its body. I could not detect any odor over the horrid stench from that three-legged tomcat. It had to be that tall in order to bend over the railing on the porch and have its face against my window. That end of the mobile home was perched over the side of a hill, right under that big oak tree. I'm a very good observer, generally speaking. I was good at shooting down aircraft and other military targets while in the Navy. As a member of the U.S. government survey crew and a Forest Service cartographer and a military recon photo analyst, I know how to gather pertinent details. There are not half a dozen folk anywhere in the nation with whom I have told these things to, and in such detail. The usual response is total disbelief and awe that anyone could spin such a tale, but I have indeed had a somewhat interesting life. Some have said I should write a book, others simply dread to get me started, so I normally keep it all to myself and really have few associates these days. I failed earlier to relate that while I personally had no Sasquatch or Bigfoot experiences in the Northwest, I personally knew reputable and sane, even highly educated people who had experienced such encounters. Most were harmless, but some encounters were malevolent in nature. From my acquaintances in all the Pacific Northwest who have had such experiences, I have concluded that said creature is family-oriented and indeed raise and populate the world in areas where they find comfort and sustenance much like us, but they choose to generally observe us and avoid us at all costs. If possible, and by all means, we should be aware of them, but also avoid them if possible. I was once an avid outdoorsman. I love to camp, fish, and hunt, but I will not go into the forest to stay overnight now unless equipped with at least the largest bore weapon available. Anything less, if used in defense, will merely enrage the wounded creature. The smallest creature ever reported is capable of ripping the largest and strongest human male to shreds in seconds, and you just may become dinner. I knew well a devout Christian family, all highly educated in Washington State. They were not known to lie or embellish. They had close, regular exposure to families of these creatures. That was adjacent to the U.S. Air Force Survival School in the mountains of northeast Washington State above Cusick, Washington. The Air Force made pilots parachute into those mountains to survive or die and were not allowed to have any human contact until the course was terminated. There's no telling the stories that those flyers could tell, or the instructors who manned the school. My Arkansas experience. My small wooded plot was adjacent to the Ouachita National Forest. Not so much as a fence separated it. There are many natural caves above my old property. Also, all throughout that region are crystal mines, many not yet operative. Anyone or any creature can definitely make any number of those home if needed. In the late 90s, I found myself working as an electrical contractor at a nearby chemical plant. The men I worked with there were older and not filled with as much nonsense as me, and this led to a lot of fun-filled debate in the break room. For example, one of our biggest debates was about who was the greatest athlete of modern times. Partly tongue-in-cheek, I asserted that it was Evel Knievel, based on the fact that he put all of it on the line to score, and that if he missed his goal, there was no steak or hot tub waiting, but rather a visit to the hospital or even to the morgue. After a lot of debate and ribbing, the subject turned to Bigfoot. One of the older men said, "Yeah, I guess you believe in Bigfoot too, don't you?" To which I replied, "Yes, I believe there's a possibility that Bigfoot does exist. I wouldn't rule him out." Again, these men, being hardened and level-headed hunters and fishermen, they laughed and made some more smart remarks. It was all in good fun, and none of us really took it seriously. Our silly break room banter was just our way of blowing off steam and forgetting for a few minutes the hard labor and the intensely dangerous work conditions that we faced every day. That day, my work partner, Remo, asked me, "Do you really think Bigfoot could be real?" And I replied, "To be honest, I hope it is. One thing is for sure, when I get to heaven, I'll find out." Remo then said, "If I tell you something, will you not mention it to the other guys?" I said, "Of course," knowing he was about to tell me something that he trusted me with. And so Remo began to tell me his story. 3 years ago, I went deer hunting. I have a regular spot that I go to where I have a tree stand set up and there are plenty of natural attractors for deer. I kill a deer almost every time I go there. I had been there the weekend before to make sure my stand was there and in good shape so there would be no surprises when I came back to hunt. I was pulling into my parking location well before sunrise. I got out and started loading up my gear, and I saw an empty truck that had obviously arrived before me. I knew this because there was frost on the windshield. The rifle rack was empty, and an empty bottle of apple scent was laying on the ground next to the truck. I figured it was another hunter who just liked the same area that I did. The evidence of another hunter would normally discourage most, but it was a vast national forest area in northeast Tennessee and the Roan Mountain area, and there was plenty of room for more than one hunter. Also, for the most part, this is an area where people are still neighborly and considerate to one another. I began to hear a ruckus coming from some distance away deep in the woods. This was going to scare off the deer if these guys keep it up. I put on my hat and vest and I started down the trail towards the location of my deer stand. As I walked, I could hear limbs breaking and someone yelling for help. Someone was in trouble, so I picked up the pace. As I topped a small rise and started down the opposite side, I caught sight of a man running as hard as he could, and he was in a panic. It had to be this other hunter. As the man approached, I could see the look of sheer terror in his eyes, and he screamed, "Run! Run! Follow me! Let's run!" And he never slowed his pace as he ran past me. I followed him back down the trail towards the trucks, and I noticed that he did not have a rifle. This was really odd. Who goes deer hunting without a rifle? We reached the trucks about the same time, and he collapsed from exhaustion. Remo questioned the man and asked what happened, fully expecting to hear that he had stumbled onto a moonshine still or a marijuana grow. These can be dangerous to stumble upon because these grows are closely guarded. "Monster" was all he said over and over. "Monster! Monster!" Even though his eyes darted around wildly, checking in all directions, he took just enough time before tearing down the gravel road at breakneck speed to say that a 10-foot-tall, ape-like black monster had attacked him after he took a shot at it. He claimed the shot only infuriated the creature and it charged his tree stand. In what seemed like a single movement, the creature charged him, ripped the gun from his hands, pulled the tree stand down to the ground with him in it, and crouched down facing the man as it burst forth with a deafening roar right in his face. The hunter scrambled to his feet and tore through the woods in terror. Remo was stunned. He wondered if this was a trick to run him out of the forest and his favorite hunting spot. After a self-motivational pep talk, Remo decided that it would take more than a crazy fairy tale to keep him from getting a deer that day. He proceeded back to the trail and made the hike to his tree stand. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary when he got there. Surely the other hunter had a nightmare while sleeping in his stand, or maybe he had mental problems, or could have been under the influence of drugs. Whatever it was, it didn't matter now. Remo had settled into his stand and was ready for a good hunt. He heard the crunch of dry leaves in the distance, but he couldn't see the animal due to the faint light of the early morning. Maybe a deer was heading his way. The animal was coming straight to him, and he was perfectly positioned for the kill. The light of the rising sun had revealed all the details of the landscape for many yards in every direction, so he scanned the woods looking and waiting. He focused in on something that was unusual and didn't belong in the woods. The shapes were wrong. Not far away was the twisted and mangled remains of a tree stand. The wind shifted and a horrible smell overtook him. As he looked around him searching for the animal and now what was producing that nasty odor, and just beyond his stand on the ground was the broken stock of a deer rifle. Something was way off about this whole situation. The rustling leaves was coming closer, but it was not the familiar sound of a big buck. It was the heavy thud of 2 feet walking. Becoming a bit unnerved, he decided to quietly make his way down the tree and quickly jogged back to his truck. He did not wait around to see what this thing was. He got in his truck and he left. I could see that he was embarrassed to admit this, but I also seemed to be relieved to have finally shared it with someone. His nervousness quickly left as I assured him that I would not share his story with the other men. Remo never said if he ever went back to that spot, but I knew him for years and he never mentioned hunting, just fishing. I wonder sometimes if Bigfoot won a victory over the rights to his territory that day. I cannot claim to know the truth about this story, but I can vouch for the man who shared it with me. He was an honest, hard-working, no-nonsense man. He told me his story at great risk of intense ridicule from others. I was born to a large family in Costa Rica in 1971. Back then, it was still a very rural and remote place to live, and there were no main roads, and farmers were still breaking into the jungle using hand tools and farm animals, and my playmates were all of my brothers and sisters, mainly sisters, and many cousins. We were a large group of kids running through my grandparents' farm barefoot, looking for our next big adventure in the newly made pastures, where my grandpa and uncles kept the horses and cattle they bred. We all had specific chores laid out by my grandmother, Marie Louisa. She was a rugged, caring woman who was always on edge. Her word was law. Sometimes we were introduced to that law by the rugged edge of her flip-flops. The kids, from ages 7 to 10, were in charge of feeding the chickens and gathering eggs, carrying milk buckets back from the corral, gathering vegetables from the greenhouse and wood for the fire. The older kids got to ride the horses to herd cattle each morning and then milk the cows. They were usually up before daybreak to do their chores. Later in the day, they were also the ones who delivered lunches to my grandfather Fernando, my uncles, and adult cousins who were out working to clear more land for more pastures and more crops. The farm ran like a well-oiled machine. We all pulled our weight in order to survive. And we all looked out for each other. It had to be that way. And back then the jungles and prairies were still full of all kinds of animals that could seriously hurt us or even kill us. From fire ants and spiders to venomous snakes and jaguars, we had to be careful of everything. More often than not, when my uncles ventured into the jungle, they were going to have a close call with a large predator. But there was only one rifle available on the farm. Being careful and watching out for each other was the only way to survive. My farmhouse sat like an oasis on the hill in the middle of that thick, dark rainforest. From there, we never went out alone. We were always in pairs or groups. The kids carried machetes for protection, and the rifle was reserved for my grandfather or one of my uncles. One morning, my cousin Raoul fell off his horse while gathering the cattle for milking. And when it came time to deliver lunch to the men, he was in no shape to go. I was 10 then, almost old enough to join my older cousins in their chores, and already a brave horseman. It was my time to shine. I went and got my horse that was a gift from my father, and it was an old, slow animal who had seen its best days as a workhorse long before I received it. But it was a safe choice for a kid. I would come to regret that later. My Aunt Anna loaded me up with my share of the lunch we were bringing to the men, and I was off with 3 of my cousins to make the delivery. It all went well until we hit the tree line to enter the jungle. I was thinking, how am I supposed to get in there with this big horse? But Bayou, my horse, knew better. He was last in the line with my older cousins leading the way and breaking through the undergrowth when necessary. We made our way through the jungle with my cousin Jose guiding us toward the sounds of axes and chopping wood. I was in my own world. Never had I seen so many different shapes and colors. There were all kinds of new sounds from birds and animals that I didn't know. But suddenly, I recognized the sound of a yellow picked toucan. Ahead of me, Carlos asked, "Hey, Jose, I thought they were working near the river, same as yesterday." "Well, I thought so too," Jose answered, "but it seems they changed their plans, who knows?" The peace and tranquility of the ride was suddenly interrupted by a horrible, strange odor. It smelled like a bunch of pigs had farted in my face. Okay. At first, I thought it was one of the horses. Oh, I'm sorry, y'all. At first, I thought it was one of the horses. My cousins started pointing fingers and blaming each other. Even the horses seemed offended by it. They started snorting and neighing and jumping about. We continued on until Jose suddenly jolted back on his horse's harness and started looking around as if he was searching for something. Pepe looked back at me and put his finger to his mouth to signal silence. His eyes were wide with fear, and I began to panic. And then he burst into laughter, and I knew I was being pranked. I rolled my eyes and looked around to see what Jose was searching for. "There they are," he cried as he jumped from his horse and tied it to a bush. And then he ran over and grabbed a set of vines. Apparently, it was time to play for a few minutes. So I jumped down from my horse and pulled off the rubber boots I was wearing to protect my feet from the thick bushes and long thorns, and I joined the others. We climbed up the vines and took turns swinging back and forth. "Watch out," Jose cautioned. "Don't let go. It's a long drop-off if you do." On my third turn, I noticed it had gotten unusually quiet. The birds had ceased to chirp, and a cold chill filled the air. As I swung back toward the tree, I expected Jose's arm to grab me and pull me in, but to my surprise, he was looking the other way. Keeping me from falling was the last thing on his mind. I missed my catch, and I was hanging on for dear life. Just as I was about to let go, Carlos grabbed me by the waist. His eyes were wide open and his face was pale, and he wanted to say something to me, but no words would come. I was trying to make a place for myself on the crowded branch when Jose's hand came hard over my mouth to prevent me from saying anything, And when I saw it, my heart fell into my stomach, and I felt the certain urge to pee. 100 meters from us, sitting hunched over on a tree base, was something big and hairy. At first, I thought I was looking at some kind of big anteater. There are no bears in the tropics of Costa Rica, so that thought never crossed my mind. The creature, whatever it was, stood up in full view of us, and it looked like a man, but it was massive. Below us, Carlos's horse started to get a bit jumpy. He was whinnying and pulling at his harness, and I knew the shit was about to hit the fan, and Pepe was looking for a way to get off the branch. Jose's horse was making its way around the big trunk, and we were all getting ready to jump, but all I could think was, oh great, Bayou is an old horse. I'll be the last one out of here. The Holy Trinity, here comes that thing, Pepe gasped in Spanish. My priorities changed from keeping my balance on the tree branch to jumping down as quickly as possible and running as fast as my legs would carry me. In the next instant, I found myself lying face down on the jungle floor with a mouth full of leaves. And as I got up to dig in and run, I felt a strong tug on my shorts. Then I was face up, and the jungle was spinning around me, and I found myself on the back of Jose's horse. We were cantering out of there at breakneck speed with my cousin doing the best he could to hold on to me. Well, I did not dare to look back to see if it was chasing us, and it sounded like a derailing freight train. The lunches, my boots and saddle pads and everything else were not important anymore. We raced through the dense jungle with the bushes hitting me everywhere. A deafening roar reverberated through the rainforest as we pushed our horses onward. I saw one of my cousins pass us in a split second, and at one point I gouged Jose so deeply with my nails that he wore the imprint for several days. I guess I was in survival mode. We burst through the tree line, and we were in the open pasture again, and we pulled up to Pepe and Carlos, who had made it out safely, and they were waiting for us. We were all terrified. Jose kicked his horse back into full gallop, and the others followed, but we didn't stop until we reached a nearby creek where we stopped for a drink of water. "My horse!" I was crying. "What should I do?" I couldn't stop crying at the thought of Bayou being eaten by that thing. We took stock of one another, making sure we were all in one piece, and then we continued our ride back to the farmhouse. No one spoke except for me. I kept asking what we were going to say to Granny Louisa when she learned that we hadn't delivered lunch to the men. Finally, Jose slapped me in the head and he said, "You say what happened, and that is all. Now shut up." The rest of the ride home took an eternity, and I couldn't wait to get there, even if it meant being reprimanded by Granny Louisa. After all, we had not only not delivered lunch to the men, we had managed to lose all of our stuff and my horse, Bayou, and he was probably being eaten by a monster in the jungle at the moment. As we neared the house, I saw there was a gathering on the porch, and Granny Louisa stood there with her hands on her hips and an angry expression on her face. Beside her were aunties and cousins with a mix of anger, anxiety, and curiosity on their faces. We dismounted and hung our heads in shame. "What happened?" Granny Louisa asked. Jose, being the oldest, did all the talking for us, and he told her exactly what had happened without leaving out a single detail. He even included how we drifted off for the joyride in the tree vines. "El dueño del monte," I heard one of my aunties mumble. Granny Louisa had a troubled look on her face. The rest of the family was still in the jungle. I went to sit in an old chair on the porch, but she turned to me and told me to go take care of Bayou. "Get some water and check him out," she said. "See if he's hurt." "My horse?" Didn't she see that I was riding with Jose? "Yes," she said, "your horse. He came back about 10 minutes ago all sweaty and troubled." Bayou was the oldest and slowest horse, but he was the first one to make it back, and I was astonished. Maybe it was because he had no rider. I went to see about him, He had 4 big scratches on his rear that looked like nail marks, but he was otherwise okay. By mid-afternoon, the work crew had come back to the house as well. They knew something was wrong when they didn't get their lunches. Jose was elected again to tell my grandpa Fernando what had happened, and he repeated the same story without missing a detail. For the next few days, the men didn't return to the jungle. Instead, they worked around the farm doing other stuff. And not long after that, my parents separated, and my mother took me and 2 of my cousins to live in Ciudad Quesada, or Quesada City, if you will. It was some years later when Mom told us the truth. Carlos and Jose were not my cousins. They were my brothers. I would never see my grandparents again, and nor did I ever see my beloved Bayou after that. It would be 30 years before I saw anyone on that side of the family again, but that's a different story for another time. In the 1980s, environmentalists and politicians began working on laws to protect the deforestation of the rainforest in Costa Rica. Today, 25% of Costa Rica is protected land. So I guess whatever chased us that day, whatever scratched Bayou, is still out there. Some time ago, I left a comment saying that I would write you about an experience I had sometime around 1997 in Memphis, Tennessee. You really must forgive me for not writing as soon as I said I would, but I started thinking about how unexciting and uncertain my experience was, and I became hesitant to share it. Nevertheless, what I'm about to write really happened. I warn you, it's not much of an experience, if it is one at all. As a matter of fact, I didn't know I was having an experience at the time, and I wouldn't know today, were it not for circumstances that later came to my understanding. I was born and raised in eastern Arkansas, my little town at the last hilly area of Crowley's Ridge where it ended in the Delta Plain on the western banks of the Mississippi River. The closest town to ours in Mississippi was a place called Lula. I only mention this to you so that you know that I'm also a son of the South, and I grew up, like you, I think, in the Mississippi River Delta. Yes, sir, that's where I grew up. We're river rats, man. Later in life, after I was married, I lived in Memphis, Tennessee. My subdivision was called Oak Haven, which boasts many mature stands of isolated forests all over, hence the name Oak Haven. Sometime after my experience, I realized that these stands of forest and underbrush extended due south of my home to northwestern Mississippi without a break, except for a few well-traveled roads that could easily be crossed at night without anyone noticing. It's possible to travel as far as South Haven, Mississippi, within the tree line of the woods that I mentioned. My home was about 5 miles north of State Line Road, the border between Tennessee and Mississippi. I had a beautiful home that backed up to a large green park. 100 yards due east of my home was a little creek that drained into a 10-acre lake. One of the aforementioned mature stands of forest ran alongside the creek, intersected only by one lonely residential road. It bordered the part of the park that people did not frequent, maybe because of a regular tall grass that was ever present and the fear of snakes. The city kept this area cut, but only every couple of weeks, so the grass would often be too tall for such pleasantries as picnics and things like that. Over the years, I spent many an evening cooking out and having friends over, but one particular night, I believe it was 1997, I was home alone and standing out on my recently built freestanding deck. I was congratulating myself on the craftsmanship and choice of location. Placed on a partial slope, it was tucked into the pines and flanked by a couple of big maples, but still afforded a spectacular view of the river. It was just after dark in the late summer, with a huge full moon looming over the line of woods that grew along the creek. I was standing completely still, watching the moon and thinking how glorious this sight was, when out of the corner of my eye I caught movement. It looked like someone walking out in the field. I took note of the fact that he looked like a really tall basketball player with exceptionally wide shoulders, and that he was just casually walking along my neighbor's chain-link fence. He seemed to have a spring in his step that made him bounce along in a side-to-side motion. The fact that he appeared to be wearing all black gave the impression of him being no more than a silhouette in the moonlight. He had a tall, thin, powerful-looking physique, marred only slightly by a bit of a beer belly. His path took him right along my backyard fence where I stood watching, hidden from view through the low-hanging maple leaves. He must have sensed someone watching him because he suddenly stopped and stood completely motionless for 5 seconds or so before dropping straight down into the tall grass. I found this behavior alarming, so much so that I turned and quickly retreated across my yard to my back door. Once inside, I locked the doors before cautiously peering through the windows. I couldn't see anything out there now, but I was troubled by what I had seen for the rest of the night. A few days later, with that incident pushed completely out of my mind, I had another one of my little get-togethers. My wife worked second shift, so these were usually just guys hanging out and cooking steaks. That night was no exception. We had our meal and we were just hanging out when we decided that the citronella candles weren't doing their jobs and decided to go inside with our beers. As we sat around talking, something suddenly shook the whole house with a thunderous smack. I had vaulted ceilings and judged the impact to be at least 12 feet up. Furious that someone or something had hit my home, I went outside to check it out. Some of the others followed me out, but we could find no evidence of anything that could have hit the house. I thought maybe a goose had flown into it, but that didn't really make sense. We spent the rest of the evening passing theories around as to what it might have been. None of them seemed to hold water. It would be many years before I would learn that house slapping is a common behavior of a Bigfoot. I believe I saw a Bigfoot that night, and it upset him that I watched him while he was unaware. I think he slapped my house in retaliation. I also believe he was drawn there by the many cookouts. I know it doesn't sound like much, but it happened. I would prefer not to have my name used, but the people who live around there will know who I am through the description of my house. Not long after this happened, I relocated to Arizona for other reasons, still ignorant of what I had seen and experienced. It wasn't until I began reading and listening to shows like yours that I finally realized I had had an encounter. I live in Clwyd County in North Wales, United Kingdom. I'm lucky to live in such a beautiful place surrounded by hills and woodland and an abundance of farms. We also have a lot of paved roads that lead to the more secluded areas. There was a spot on one of these narrow roads to nowhere that I and my friend Scott liked to go where we could chill out and enjoy some good banter and good chat. The spot we frequented was a lay-by about a third of the way up a damaged road with a steep incline and many hairpin turns as it snaked in an S up the side of a small mountain. The road was edged with 40 to 50-foot conifers, some ash and a few large oaks. Just off the road was a large piece of woodland. I say large because on our tiny island, 300 acres is large. On this stretch of road where there are no street lights, homes were few and far between and were inset back, so any lights from them didn't reach the road. It was dark as dark can be out there at night. One fall evening, Scott and I visited our usual spot with another friend we called Jack. We had been there maybe an hour, paying no mind to any of the surrounding area outside of the white 92 Nissan Mercury we had bundled into. We were laughing and having a good time, just enjoying each other's company. We hadn't even noticed how quiet the woods were. Suddenly, the inside of the car went silent as well. Everyone stopped talking, and Scott reached past the steering wheel to silence the radio. We were all sure we had heard something really close. A thud made me wind down the window on the passenger side to listen. That was when I realized I couldn't hear anything in the woods. We have an abundance of wildlife in this area, another reason I feel so lucky to live here. There are rabbits and squirrels, red fox, badger, deer, owls, and other birds of prey like kite and buzzards. At that moment, none of them were making a sound. Not even the insects could be heard. The only noise that broke the silence was the light rustling that was coming from a field that was situated up a steep embankment just to our left. It was coming from the other side of the field. We thought nothing of it until we heard another thud right next to my open window. A rock the size of a small melon had been thrown with great power and even more impressive accuracy towards us and landed a couple of feet short of the vehicle. It hit the ground so violently that I was sprayed with muddy rainwater right into my face. That was it. My window came up. Not that a window would have stood a chance against a rock that size, but it made me feel better knowing there was something between us and whatever had just hurled a 30-pound rock. We were considering our options, which in all honesty shouldn't have taken as long as it did. It was obvious that we should have just gotten the heck out of Dodge at that very moment, but for some reason we stalled on making our getaway. I looked up and out of the front window and then quickly hushed the others, telling them to look dead ahead. Our car was pointed as though we would drive straight up the hill to the next hairpin that was perhaps 50 feet away. The incline put the gravel level at about 10 to 12 feet higher than we were. We all saw it. Rather, we saw its eyes. Two big, round, amber-colored eyes hovered about 6 inches apart and what I estimated to be some 11 feet off the ground. This thing must have been immense in height and stature. I have always been a bit big for my boots with a chip on my shoulder, a naturally brave person. It helps being 5'10" and 230 pounds of muscle from manual farm work and many hours in the gym. Jack isn't a small guy either, standing 6 feet tall and weighing around 215 pounds. But Scott was a mere 5'10" and 170 pounds. Being the brave boy I am, I got out of the car to get a better look. Scott and Jack were both yelling, "What the hell are you doing, Jay? Come back, get back in here, we need to leave." I gave them a soft hush and started to slowly make my way up towards the eye shine. Maybe I was hoping it was an owl perched on a low branch. As I got nearer, I realized this wasn't the case. I started to make out the creature's outline, and as I did, I stopped dead in my tracks. This thing was enormous. I was now maybe 30 feet away from it, and I could see that it had short but very thick legs, a long body, and thick, long arms. If it had a neck, it was half an inch long. Either that or its shoulder muscles were the size of a grown pig. It was easily 10 or 11 feet tall and 4 to 5 feet wide at the shoulders. I just stared as it made a low huff with every breath. That was when I turned from a big brave boy to a scared little girl and started walking backwards towards the car. I got back in and quietly said, "Drive." There was a pause before he reacted, but before Scott could turn the key in the ignition, we heard another thud. It was another rock, slightly smaller than the last, and it had been thrown and fell just shy of the vehicle. This time I screamed at Scott, "Just drive, Scott!" And he did. Never before has a 1000cc hatchback been driven so quickly. Fair play to Scott for the previous unseen skill. Thinking about it now, I don't think whatever this creature was wanted to hurt us, it just wanted us to go. Mission accomplished, and we got out, nor did we return to this spot for several weeks. I had another encounter with this thing, and it happened some months later in a different area of our surrounding woodlands, but only 2 miles or so from the spot I visited with Scott and Jack. I was hiking alone in the springtime near a derelict castle called Gurick Castle. I'm sure I got that wrong. It has been long abandoned, though many attempts have been made to restore the castle. It was in the middle of the afternoon with many hours of daylight left. I'd heard stories of dogs going missing here, but I figured they just ran off and never found their owners, as it is a large area. However, I found evidence to suggest otherwise. I came across a small black fur. At first, I thought it was a local's farm sheep that had strayed and perhaps caught its wool on the brush. And as I got closer, I realized it was fur and not wool. A little further up the trail, I found some more, a lot more. A full Labrador's coat of black fur. There were a few bones licked clean. Some had been splintered as if bitten with great force. I started to get the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I heard a loud wood on wood knock. I shot to an upright stance and stared intently in the direction from which it came, but I saw nothing. After my previous encounter several months earlier, I wanted nothing to do with this. I turned back into the frightened little girl again. I spun around and hightailed it back down the trail and broke from the tree line faster than I knew I could. Lily! Hush! Lily! Quit barking! Lily! Oh my gosh, this dog, it's my little pug. She won't shut up. She barks at everything. I'm sorry to interrupt this story. I spun around and hightailed it back down the trail and broke from the tree line faster than I knew I could. I've told no one about these two encounters until now. Neither Scott nor Jack have spoken of it either. I didn't even tell them about the second encounter, nor have I had another encounter or seen any signs of it since. In my mind, there's nothing that is going to tell me otherwise, although I thought Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and Yeti lived in North America and Russia. I know now that they are on UK soil as well. Bigfoot lives in my town, discreetly and quietly, without being seen or heard by the majority of people. I hope to God that it stays that way. The first encounter took place in the summer of 1976 at Cougar Hot Springs, 9 miles outside of Blue River, Oregon, in the Willamette National Forest. I was living in the woods in Willamette National Forest with my boyfriend in a semi-log cabin. I say semi because it had a roof and walls on only 3 sides. There was no bathroom, kitchen, or bedroom. A fire pit stood in front of where the 4th wall should have been. The nearest home was 9 miles away. Since it was a national forest, regular housing was not allowed. We were about a mile from the actual hot springs for which the place was named, but it was mainly frequented by hippies back then, since hiking had not yet become popular. The cabin could only be reached by going up a small path on a steep old-growth timber-covered mountainside. There were no roads beyond the highway below, no campers or camping, or no dwelling of any kind. No one was hanging around the cabin during the day. It was only used by us and an occasional friend or two at night. We were hiding from the police. I had run away from home to escape my alcoholic stepfather. The hot springs was a party place with a lot of pot smoking and drinking. It was not a family place by any means. One moonless night, as we were climbing up to the cabin at about 1 a.m, sounds erupted all around us. We were only about halfway into the woods, and being comfortable with the path, we hadn't brought a flashlight. There were multiple voices all yelling at the same time, if you could call it yelling. It was more like singing in the sense that the sounds were controlled. They started with 1 octave, held the note for about a minute, and then changed to another octave. They were voices in unison, almost like a choir. It went on for a good 10 minutes. They weren't human, at least they didn't sound human, but what else could they be? It was like a Gregorian chant with all the monks chanting just one sound. All that chanting at once was terrifying. We found a little copse of tall pine trees and cowered down to the ground, hugging ourselves to a tree trunk for protection and frantically whispering to each other, "What is that?" There were no lights of any kind, just voices coming from all directions, and they surrounded us. They weren't human voices, but they weren't mechanical either. They were organic and changed in perfect unison with perfect precision. They were close enough that we should have seen something. If they'd been human, we should have seen them. Even if they'd been a bunch of aliens, we'd have seen something, lights or figures moving about at least. If it had been a Satanist or Wiccans, both of which are known to use the woods for their various rites, we would have seen or heard someone or something, because these sounds were right on top of us. But we saw nothing. There were no shadows, no movement, and no other sounds either. It was like we had stepped into a different world. It was nothing like we'd ever heard or experienced before. In April of 2019, it was Easter weekend and we were camping in our RVs in Dixie Canyon, Colorado. We'd planned on boondocking, no electric or sewer hookups, just generators, in the hilly canyons outside of Dixie Canyon, east of Grand Junction, not far from the Colorado River. There was a decent-sized group of us, so we circled our RVs like a wagon train, leaving a huge place in the middle for the campfire. Ours was parked next to a ravine that was full of wash from the many commonly occurring flash floods in the canyonlands and deserts. The ground was a mix of scrub grass and red earth. All around us were ridges and slopes covered in boulders and dotted with small cave openings. The first night we played music. We cooked dinner, we made s'mores and drank wine and hung out in chairs around the fire. The kids, ranging in age from 3 to 13, rode their bikes and played around the RVs when they weren't at the fire making more s'mores. My husband went to bed early because he'd been up since 4:30 that morning. He and my son-in-law had come up early to set up camp. My daughter is a full-time nurse, and I had not retired from teaching. Suddenly, my husband stuck his head out the door and asked, "Why is someone slamming into the RV?" "What?" I exclaimed. "We're all sitting here by the fire. No one's around the RV or slamming into it." And then I asked, "Was it Minnie?" Minnie was a tiny min pin. "No," he said, "it was too heavy, like a person. Someone slammed into the RV. Minnie's too small. She couldn't have done that." I had a creepy feeling in my gut at that point, but I didn't say anything. The next day, everyone went to explore one of the red earth-covered ridges while I took a shower. They said they were going to wait for me, but the 3-year-old twins got antsy, so they all went ahead. I didn't know it, but one of the women found a huge footprint on top of that ridge. She took a picture of it, but it wasn't until later when she posted it to Facebook that I knew anything about it. In the early hours of the next morning, around 4 a.m., my husband jerked me awake and whispered loudly, "What was that?" "What was what?" I asked, still half asleep. "You didn't feel that?" he said emphatically. "No, what?" I answered, confused. "Someone slammed into the RV hard enough to rock it," he said, and then he added, "I'm not going out there to find out what it was." I knew then what was going on. Inside, I was freaking out. My husband knew I believed in Bigfoot. Later we talked about it. He said it was a person big enough to rock the entire RV. This RV is 35 feet long. It has a bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, living room, and a second small room with 2 bunks. We eventually went outside to look for footprints, but we didn't find anything. We searched down in the ravine as well, but there were no footprints there either. On a warm June day in 2019 at Sequoia National Forest, my family and I were hiking one of the seldomly used pathways. As we entered, we'd heard wood knocks and sounds like monkeys. There were no other sounds at all, no birds or insects, and no wind. At one point, we heard something huge slam into the ground not far from us. We thought it was an airplane. When we witnessed a commercial airliner crash into some houses in San Diego in 1977, there was a mushroom cloud of smoke, so we looked up, but we didn't see any of that. We knew it wasn't an earthquake either. Later, as we headed out, we came across some park rangers in the parking area who wanted to ask us some questions. And we told them about the sound, and they told us it was a tree that had fallen. They said nothing like that ever happened before. We thought that was odd because trees come down there every year. They didn't elaborate, so we assumed they must have been referring to the fact that it was a warm, windless day, not a snowstorm or other inclement weather. On Monday, December the 2nd, 2019, in Grand Junction, Colorado, my husband had gone to bed early. He's a chef, and Tuesdays are truck day, meaning he has to get up early and be at the restaurant to check the food delivery. He has no trouble sleeping with the television and lights on, so as always, I was up much later than him. I'm retired now, finally, as a teacher. Our house is on the edge of town in a semi-rural area known as Orchard Mesa next to the Colorado River. To the west, it extends into the Colorado National Monument, which is similar to a small Grand Canyon. To the south, it is the La Salle Mountain Range and the Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah borders. East of us are fields, farms, vineyards, pastures, and small hills, all connected to the bottom of the 10,000-foot-high Grand Mesa, at the top of which is a collapsed volcano that forms the largest mesa platform in the country. It's dotted with alpine meadows and hundreds of lakes, past which the Colorado River winds as it makes its way to our Orchard Mesa. The river in this section is heavily wooded on both sides, and all sorts of animals frequent the river. We have a few crabapple trees in the garden section of our yard, as do our neighbors. We also have grapevines and mulberry trees, all of which are inviting for various animals. And our house sits on half an acre enclosed by a tall wooden fence, except for one section that is blocked off by both a huge shed and a small one connected by a gate. This is to keep our dogs from escaping through our neighbor's short wire fence. We used to keep a garden back there, but life has sort of gotten in the way, and now it's abandoned and full of tall grass. As my husband slept and I watched TV, our dog Daisy ran through the dog door out into the backyard and immediately started barking like someone was out in the road walking by. My other dog, Timmy, who generally ignores Daisy's youthful antics, perked up his ears and then jumped off the bed and ran out the door to join her. I was a bit surprised and frankly a little concerned that they might wake up my husband. It was not entirely unusual for them to bark at the fence. People walk their dogs down to the river all the time, but this time the barking was different. Instead of the typical intermittent barking interspersed with running and pacing along the fence, they were barking on the move, as if they were hysterical. I knew immediately something was in the yard. I panicked with the thought that they may have cornered a rabid skunk or a coon. I didn't want to have to break up any fights. Even more so, I didn't want to get bit. And furthermore, we once saw a raccoon in our garbage area big enough to be mistaken for a dog. If that's what they were up against, I knew they would be outmatched. With all of this running through my mind, I jumped out of bed and grabbed a flashlight from the cupboard and headed outside. I could see them all in the small shed barking towards the abandoned garden area. I was grateful for the fence between them and whatever they were barking at, and I yelled for them to stop it and come on in. 20 years of teaching and 38 years of parenting has given my voice the kind of authoritative sound not to be ignored. But the speed with which they responded was more than just a little surprising. I figured it must have been a raccoon they were barking at. Bears were already hibernating. Dogs would have barked back or even fought back, and a cat would have run off right away. After I ushered the dogs back into the house, curiosity got the better of me, and I turned the powerful flashlight I was using back on the yard. I stepped as close to the little shed as fear and caution would allow, and I raised the light a little higher. And I caught movement behind and a little above it. The problem was I shouldn't have been able to see anything above the shed. The only thing back there to stand on was the neighbor's flimsy 4-foot-high wire fence. However, I could see a bulky shape moving around back there like someone hunched over in an orange and tan coat. My mind started racing with thoughts and questions. Is that the neighbor's teens going up to no good again? Those kids had proven themselves to be trouble in the past, so anything was possible. And then I realized the person in question was coming into my yard. I couldn't believe they weren't reacting to the light. It was all happening so quickly, though, that I didn't have time to do anything but watch while this person moved closer. He or she or it was moving in a weird gliding way. There was no head bobbing, just a smooth glide. I thought, is that a cat on top of the roof? But it was too big. Why was it so big? Was it a raccoon? How did it get up the side of the metal shed? And then the moment hit, the exact second when my eyes revealed the truth and my mind accepted it. It had stopped gliding and turned towards me, creating a silhouette made up of an apex center and sloping shoulders. This wasn't something on top of the roof, it was something behind the shed. And if I could see it, this something had to be taller than 8 feet. I knew what it was. I couldn't breathe as I stared at that classic Patty-style Bigfoot silhouette. I could see long tan hair streaked with brown covering its head. I don't remember its eyes. Maybe I didn't want to make eye contact. That would have made it more real and more dangerous. It froze, and my mind began to tell me I was only seeing stone where it was standing. I couldn't be seeing anything, I thought. This is my fault, and it's here. They know me. This is my fault. I kept staring at the stone image in front of me, burning the picture into my mind, proving to myself I was seeing it, and telling myself I wasn't crazy. I could feel it looking at me. Fright dissolved into flight. Run! I mentally screamed at myself. And instantly I turned and ran back inside, slamming the locked door behind me. More questions came. Should I wake my husband? What should I do? Oh my God, I don't know what to do. He won't believe me anyway. I know he knows now that these things exist, but he won't believe that there's one in our backyard. It's just too much of a coincidence. Not knowing what else to do, I turned to the group chat on Messenger where I had shared my other experiences. Fortunately, someone was online and I was able to relate the entire event. He told me to go back out there. What? Heck no, I said. There's no way. Try, he said. Somewhere down inside, maybe foolishly, I found the courage to take his advice. At his request, I put him on live feed, and carrying my phone and the flashlight, I went back outside. I was grateful for the light behind that shed that revealed no silhouette this time. My adrenaline was so high, so much so that I barely noticed the icy cement under my stockinged feet. But standing out there and facing my fear was quickly erasing the terror that had gripped me earlier. The next day, as instructed by my friend, I went back out and took pictures. When my husband got home, I told him the entire ordeal, and we walked out together to look at the grass that was tamped down. There was a path leading to the neighbor's wire fence. There were spots that could be giant footprints, but all too grassy to be sure. But it was evidence enough for me, so I examined the shed and confirmed that there was no place for a raccoon to climb on top of it. I took pictures of everything. It was a hot June night in that old trailer my ex-husband and I were living in behind my parents' house. It was still and quiet that night. With no air conditioning, we had windows open in hopes of catching a breeze if one should happen by. I was on the couch listening to the buzz of the light bulb glowing overhead, and I asked my husband, "Can you hear this?" "Hear what?" he said. "Listen," I said. "It's so quiet out that I can hear the light bulb glowing." He listened for a minute and agreed that he could hear it too. My parents taught me to be aware of my surroundings, and one of the things they always said to look for was when it got real quiet. It meant one of two things. Either there was a predator nearby or there was a big storm brewing. My ex-husband being a city boy, I thought it was something he needed to know. Even with the windows open that night, we couldn't hear crickets or tree frogs or anything else, only that light bulb buzzing. At the time, we had a permanent house guest named Tony. He was 15 years old, and he was one of those situations where he came to visit and sort of made a career out of it. I knew his parents, and they lived back in the county 6 miles away. And I don't know how they felt about him moving in with us or if they even knew about it, but he stayed for months. Tony had a crush on my friend Becky, and that night he'd taken his motorcycle to see her. Becky lived way out on a gravel road that went through the swamps and past my grandfather's house and through a whole lot of woods with maybe only 1 or 2 other houses in between. It was about as isolated as a person could get, and driving down to her house at night, even in a car, was enough to give a person the creeps. He hadn't been gone long when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. A few minutes passed, and I heard Tony's motorcycle barreling back up the road and down our driveway. He wasn't slowing down for the turn, or when he approached our trailer. And through the window, I could see his light tracing his path. He jumped off his bike and he threw it down without shutting off the engine or the light. And a second later, the door burst open and he fell through onto the floor where he curled up in a fetal position. He was shaking and whimpering like a baby. Well, I jumped up and got down beside him, and I was trying my best to find out what was wrong, but he couldn't talk. I could tell he was going into shock, and I was about to slap him to try and bring him out of it when he finally responded to yelling at me, saying, "What's wrong?" Tears streamed down his face as he told us what happened in a quivering voice. He said he was on his way back from Becky's and had made it past Grandfather's house, where the road dipped into a steep hill heading into the swamp. His motorcycle was beginning to shimmy on the loose gravel. With all that vibrating, his light was jumping all over, but he still managed to see something huge standing on the old wooden bridge at the bottom of the hill. It was big enough that he thought about turning around and heading back the other way. And if he thought his motorcycle would make it back up that steep hill, he probably would have. As he got closer to the thing, he made up his mind to gun the engine and pass it wide open. A little closer, and he was able to make out that it had a body like a bear, but a face of a man. It was too late to turn back now, so he opened the throttle up and he went speeding by. And that's when it gave out a big yell and it reached out and tried to grab him. "I saw his fingers and its nails," he sobbed. Thank the good Lord that it didn't catch him. Well, I didn't know what to say. All I could do was listen and try to comfort him. He wasn't drinking, and Tony didn't use drugs. He spent that night sleeping at the foot of our bed, and several times he woke me up whimpering like a baby. I never once called him crazy or accused him of telling us a tall tale. I really do believe he saw something that night, and it gave him the scare of a lifetime. That night, as I lay there between my broken sleep, I remembered what my sister told me after I'd gone to see The Legend of Boggy Creek. They showed the Patterson-Gimlin film that night, too, and after I finished telling her all about the movie, she told me that our grandfather had seen something back in the 1930s when he was going through the gravel pits. He described it as having the body of a bear, but the face of a man. I never told anyone what my sister told me about our grandfather. There was no way Tony could have known. But he described that thing the same way my grandfather did. He said it was the body of a bear and the face of a man. A few months passed and my husband and I separated. It was October, and I was 8.5 months pregnant. Tony had gone back home by then, so it was just me living in the trailer. My friend Becky had come to stay the night with me. We were bored stiff. That was back when you could only get 3 major networks on the television. I've always been active, and having a baby didn't slow me down, so we decided we'd head over to visit some friends who rented a space in a field my mom and dad owned. It was 11 o'clock that night, and I didn't have any gas in my car, but we didn't care. We took out walking without a flashlight or any form of protection. We were going down that same gravel road that led to the bridge where Tony had his incident, but we weren't thinking about that. We had to go down to the swamp and then take a left after passing my brother's driveway, but before the bridge. That took us up over a hill and into the field where their house was. It was the weekend, so we knew they would be awake. The night was very nice and the weather was perfect. We passed my parents' house laughing and talking and having a good time, and then we passed my brother's driveway, still acting like a couple of kids. And shortly after that, I heard something in the woods beside me. It was matching every step we made. We were on the gravel and making the sounds feet make on gravel, but this was crunching dead leaves and breaking twigs out in the woods. I reached over and I touched Becky's arm to stop her. "Do you hear that?" I asked. "What?" she said. "Oh, it's nothing," I said after listening for a second. We started walking again. Up ahead we could see the bridge in the moonlight. I heard it again, so I stopped and asked again, "Did you hear that, Becky?" This time she had heard it. "Yes," she said. "We need to get running," I yelled. We took off running back up the road with me being 8.5 months pregnant and waddling like a penguin. We got as far as my brother's driveway and I said, "Come on, let's get to the house." Well, his driveway was steep as the hill Tony had to go down that night, but my brother's driveway was straight up. And somehow we made it to his door, and we began banging and yelling to be let in. It was midnight by then, and he wasn't exactly jumping for joy at the sight of us. But we told him that we were out walking and that something was stalking us, and we begged him to take us home. He could have shot fire at us through his eyes that he was so mad, but I didn't care. It was the first time I'd ever been frightened while out walking at night. 2 weeks later, I gave birth to a healthy 7-pound, 14-ounce, 21.5-inch son. I lost touch with Tony for years, and then one day at the grocery store, I ran into him. I asked him if he remembered that incident on the bridge. He said he did, but that he didn't like to talk about it. And then I asked if he would listen to a vocal I'd captured on my phone. He held it to his ear and he listened, and I watched his muscles draw up and tighten, and his eyes were wide and his teeth were clenched. He was reacting. He was having a flashback to that night. He made a vulgar statement about how much it was scaring him to hear that sound before lifting his hand up and staring at it. "I saw its hands and its fingers," he said in a shaky voice. "I even saw its fingernails." When I was 15 years old, I was visiting my best friend in St. Paul, Minnesota. We'd been best friends since 2nd grade, even though we lived in the same state for only 2 years. Because I had recently lost my brother in a car accident, we spent a great deal of our time ruminating endlessly about life after death and the paranormal nature of our world. Whenever I flew to Minnesota for a visit, we would hang out with a bunch of adorable 16-year-old boys who could drive. Our favorite destination was a couple of miles away. It was a beautiful lake surrounded by dense woods. We were a very clean-cut bunch, so there was no drinking at all, just breathless crushes on the private school preppy boys and lots of flirting and laughter. One summer evening, we all drove to this glorious lake in the moonlight and walked through the old-growth trees. As my friend and I stopped under one very large, gnarled, ancient tree, something inexplicable happened. It was like a glass bell jar fell over us, and we could not hear a thing. There were no crickets, no wind, and no waves lapping at the lake shore. Even the boys, who were joking around no more than 10 feet away from us, were muffled and distant sounding. I asked my friend, "Do you feel this? What's happening?" She was stunned and frightened. Clearly, only the two of us were experiencing this dead, eerie, unnatural silence. It was like we had just for a couple of minutes stumbled into an alternate dimension. Just as suddenly as it fell over us, the bell jar lifted and all the noises resumed. We're now in our mid-60s with grown children of our own. We're still best friends and we still talk about that experience. For years and years, we attributed it to my brother trying to send a message from the afterlife. In recent years, I've heard of many Bigfoot accounts and on your site that make me think now that this was a close encounter with a creature instead. It makes sense, perhaps, that they can flip into a different dimension and alter ours. Whatever the case may be, we certainly did experience something otherworldly that evening, even if just for an unforgettable moment. It was 1963. It was summertime in New York, and I was 9 years old. My older brother was 13, and at that time we lived in a county bordering Pennsylvania. It was the only county in the state without an incorporated city, and to this day it is very remote. It's as far back in the sticks as anyone can get, and if you were to go any further, you would be on your way out. We lived up a dirt road that was miles from any town with a population of even 500. The area consisted of only fields and forest. Of course, there were a lot of wildlife, and we were familiar with every species there, or so we thought. One night, my brother and I were on the front lawn. There was no moonlight, which gives you a very ominous feeling, especially when you're a kid in such a rural area. The dead silence added to the strange feelings we were having. Suddenly, the silence was broken when out of the darkness came a blood-curdling scream. "Did you hear that?" I said. I think we both spoke at the same time. Of course, we knew the other had heard it because you would have to be deaf not to. We were wide-eyed with fright, and that scream was ear-piercing, and it was not a short scream. It was terrifying and like nothing I could ever imagine. I struggled to find an explanation because I was the one who usually had the answers to things. My brother had always been a bit slower to figure things out. Therefore, I knew he would be depending on me for an explanation. I took a few minutes to think about it, and I said, maybe it's George up on the letter S road beating his wife. That was the best I could come up with, but it didn't convince my brother. Then we heard the scream again, and my brother said, "No, that scream came from the woods across the lake on this side of the stone wall. George lives way past that." I just have to stop here, and I've got a question. So George beat his wife, and you guys could hear her screaming all that way. Did anybody ever think to go over and beat the shit out of George? Just wondering. All right, let's move on with the story. The scream came the third time, and we were utterly, completely terrified. "Maybe it's a cougar," I said. That explanation didn't convince him either. He pointed out that there weren't any cougars in the area. "What is it then?" I asked. "If you didn't like any of my suggestions, what is yours?" Well, he was of no help because he said he didn't know. And then the scream stopped, and neither of us were going to enter that dark, creepy woods to find out the source. Therefore, I told myself that it must have been a cougar. Perhaps they were coming back into the area and we weren't aware of it. That answer would have to suffice for now because there was no other explanation, and for many years I held on to that belief. We never spoke of it after that or mentioned it to our parents. I think we were too afraid to even give it any more thought. In our minds, it was best if we just left the matter alone. It is unimaginable how terrified someone can become when this happens. I hadn't forgot it, and I still wanted an answer. And finally, with the help of the internet, I started to do some research. And now I'm entirely convinced that it was neither a woman screaming or a cougar. Thank God George wasn't beating his wife again. That's all I've got. That's the thing that makes me the happiest about this story. Based on the descriptions and recordings that I had heard online, I'm now sure that it was a Sasquatch. Neither my brother nor I have heard anything even remotely like we had heard on that night many years before. I'm thankful that neither of us chose to investigate the source of those terrifying screams. The outcome probably would have been a good one. Now, the writer has another story here, and I'm gonna share that with you. The following event is something I will never forget. I remember the date because it was the day before my grandfather's birthday party. It was in mid-February 2007. I left the golf course at 5 p.m. The western horizon was bright yellow by the soon-to-be setting sun. I looked to my left and observed a shape silhouette against the sky. It was approaching from the southwest. If it was a bird, it certainly was a weird-shaped one with a strange appearance. I headed toward the North Main Highway and continued to watch it as well as I could while driving. Of course, as I continued, the shape grew larger. I turned left on the main road, realizing this was not a bird. My mind was overworking as I tried to figure out what this could be. Since this thing was heading in my direction, I pulled off the main highway. It turned slightly toward me and my mouth flew open in astonishment. If someone were to post a photo of my expression at that time, I'm sure it would go viral immediately. How about posting a photo of this bird? That might go viral real quick. Anyway, I keep getting sidetracked in this story, so excuse me. In my opinion, it was a vehicle that never should have been able to get off the ground, let alone fly. I was only able to see it for a few seconds, but it is ingrained in my memory, and this is how I would describe it. It had the shape of a windowless shuttlecraft from the Starship Enterprise. It had two huge globes, one on each side, attached to the exterior of the craft, midway between the front and back. The globes were copper-colored with what looked like black O-ring gaskets around the center of each globe. There was no sound coming from this strange craft, nor was there any wind gust as one might expect as it passed overhead. It went slightly to the north and sped off at treetop level in the direction of Mount Shasta. To my surprise, the traffic was passing by as it would any other time. Was I the only one that could see this? Well, I was wondering what was going on. I got back into my car with my mind spinning and I started home. What had just happened? Why didn't anyone else react? The questions wouldn't stop entering my brain. I couldn't have been the only one that saw this craft since it came right over the main part of town. I returned home and tried to clear my mind or at least make some sense of this experience, and I decided to report it to the local police and the local newspaper. To my amazement, not a single person had reported seeing anything out of the ordinary. Since no one had seen anything, I decided to keep it to myself, even though I had a strong feeling of wanting to share this with everyone. I did tell a few people that I knew I could trust, but even to this day, they give me a lot of ribbing and make a lot of jokes about it. Now, finally, I found a place where I can share this event with everyone without being ridiculed. I'm thankful for this opportunity, and I feel a bit of relief being able to do so. So now, maybe I'm not crazy. Well, to the writer, maybe you're not crazy. And I'm so glad that George wasn't killing his wife or beating her again. I don't know why that's sticking in my mind in this story, but it was just, I don't know, it was a kind of an odd thing to assume. Oh, that's probably George beating his wife. Nothing to see here. Everybody move along. Anyway, a lot of stuff happened in this story, and for some reason, that's the only thing that sticks in my mind. So, I don't know. It's probably just me. I just thought it was kind of weird. Let's move on to something else. The year of my encounter was 2019. I had graduated high school the year before and had been attending the University of Idaho. And in the spring, I was feeling burned out and decided to take a long weekend back home to Priest Lake, Idaho. While I was home, I just felt the need to get out in the woods, which have always been my place of peace and rest. It was a season for picking morels, so I grabbed a basket and fired up my dirt bike and headed for my family's home, which was already a 20-minute drive from the nearest small town, and I went deep into the woods. I went to a secret spot where I had always had good luck picking morels, and while they weren't as plentiful as normal, there were enough to keep me in the area. I had been picking morels and wandering around for an hour and decided to sit down and rest and eat a quick snack down by the small creek that flowed through the area. I had been sitting for maybe 10 minutes when I saw a deer come walking along the creek bed. It was upwind of me and had taken no notice, so I just sat still and watched it for a few minutes until the wind shifted at 90 degrees. I caught a foul odor. Not a skunk-like odor, but more like a mixture of carrion, garbage, and feces. At that exact moment, the deer lifted its head and sniffed the air and bolted right up the bank of the creek toward me. It came close to me, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, and it didn't notice me at all. A moment later, just across the creek, I heard a loud huff and a thud, and I looked over to the creek to see what I would have described as a Bigfoot, but you will soon understand why I don't. It was a shaggy, ape-like creature, something between a gorilla and an orangutan, but it was more upright. It had matte black fur that almost seemed to absorb the light. It had a partially bare face with dark skin. It had yellow teeth with huge canines. This creature was probably 7 feet tall, and I would guess 350 pounds. It wasn't skinny, but it also was not overly bulky. I was absolutely stunned, and I was frozen where I sat. Just for a few moments after I saw it, and it saw me, and the sheer rage in its eyes became terrifying. It took a few steps toward me and then stopped, and it let out a shrieking scream that was partially like the scream of a mountain lion, and partially like the roar of an actual lion, and partially indescribable. I felt it in my chest, and I slapped my hands over my ears, almost expecting to feel blood leaking out of them. This shriek went on for what seemed like a minute, but was probably just a couple of seconds. At this point, the creature was only 60 feet away from me, just across the creek and on the other bank, and I could see the spittle and drool flying off its teeth as it screamed. It took another step toward me, and it picked up a fist-sized rock and was winding back its arm to send it flying toward me when I heard another sound from just up the creek. It was a loud whoop, and it rang out, and the creature and I turned upstream to see another creature standing in the water about 100 feet away. Now, this creature was massive. It was well over 8 feet tall, and I would guess between 450 and 550 pounds, with dark red, black matted fur. It had a hairless face and a high forehead, and it was tapering to a slight cone at the top of its head. It had a broad chest and huge shoulders with extremely long arms. One of the first things I noticed was the broad, flat teeth and nails, while the other creature had sharp teeth and claws. The first creature at this point let out another shriek, and it threw the rock at the second creature, hitting it in the chest with a distinct whomp. The second creature let out a series of barking coughs. It was almost a laughing sound, and it took a few steps toward the first creature. The first creature suddenly looked panicked and spun around and ran into the brush and off into the woods. The second creature let off after it faster than I would have ever believed possible for such a big animal. Its fur was flapping in the wind behind it, and it gave it an almost blurry appearance as it leapt up the bank in a single stride and disappeared into the woods after the first creature. Seconds later, I heard another shriek from off in the woods in the direction that they had gone, and it was followed by a much higher-pitched shriek of pain, and then a series of yelps and whines, and a moment of silence, and then a series of victorious whoops. By that time, I had finally found my ability to move, and I stood up and grabbed my basket of morals. I ran the quarter-mile to my bike as fast as I possibly could, still hearing triumphant whoops from off in the woods, and the second I got there, I kicked the engine over and tore up the old logging road I had come in on. I never bothered with my helmet until I got whipped in the face by a branch of a bush. Then I walked into the house and I took off my helmet, and my dad immediately asked me what was wrong. Well, I thought he must have seen something in my eyes, but it turned out that the branch had left a bleeding whelp on my cheek and across my nose, and I hadn't even noticed the pain. In front of my mother and my younger sister, I told my dad that I had just slipped, but later that night, alone around a campfire in the backyard, I explained to him what had really happened. He told me that I should have left the morals as a thank you and insisted that we go leave an offering first thing in the morning. We raided the refrigerator, collecting a basket of fresh vegetables, a small piece of cheese, and some peanut butter, which my dad scooped out and put in some paper cupcake wrappers. And as the sun was coming up, we left the food right where I had been sitting when I first saw the creatures. And as we pulled away in the truck a few minutes later, I heard one quiet whoop from down by the creek. I had been back to that spot several times since, but never without a sidearm, and never without a small offering of thanks to the Bigfoot that saved my life from the impersonator. When I was 20 years old, I went to work in the clothing mill. After a few years of working in the winding room, I was transferred to the print works. On second shift, it would get really hot in that room, so while they were shut down and cleaning the machine between batches, I would go out into the cool air and catch a breath. One night in November of 1972, as I was standing outside, I saw something out of the corner of my eye that was coming around the building. I turned to see a circular object that was 100 feet in diameter. It was flat on the bottom, it had a dome on the top, and it was flashing colored lights that spun around and rotated with the spin of the craft. There was a dark hole in the center of the bottom. It was a clear night with lots of stars in the sky, except where the craft blocked them out. I want to make it clear that I have never done drugs, nor have I consumed alcohol or even so much as smoked a cigarette. This was not an hallucination. I had never seen anything like this before. I wouldn't even have known what I was looking at if I hadn't watched The Day the Earth Stood Still. This craft was only about 40 feet off the ground, and it was moving slowly. It didn't make a sound, not even a whooshing sound. It was quiet in the building, so there was nothing to drown out any of the noise. I'd have heard it if this thing made any sounds. It crossed my field of view, and I yelled for a coworker to come out and see it too. He was a retired Air Force officer. He said he'd never seen anything like it either, and we watched as it drifted along and followed the river in a northerly direction toward Greenville, South Carolina. When I got home that night, my husband told me a flying saucer had been spotted over Greenville around 11 p.m. I had seen it at 10 p.m., so it took an hour to reach Greenville. I told him I had seen it too, and he laughed at me. He was an abusive man who laughed at me and made fun of me all the time for being a simple country girl. Sometimes he hit me when he was angry. It was a stressful marriage, so I didn't pursue a conversation. He worked third shift, so he had to leave for work anyway. The next day, he came home all excited. He'd driven down the road that paralleled the river the craft had followed, and he'd seen it too. I thought that was strange. Had it come back? He said a bright pulsating light was hovering above the tree, so he stopped and turned off his lights. And he watched it for a few minutes and then turned his lights back on, and it shot straight up into the sky and disappeared. But it didn't stop there. That same week, I had the oddest dream. I dreamed I was floating out the door and up the dirt road we lived on. There was a big circular object hovering over the road that I was being drawn to, and I could see a wide light coming out of the bottom, and it seemed like there were bodies standing under the craft waiting for me. Then I started feeling like I was spinning, or maybe I was feeling extremely dizzy. Either way, it felt like I was spinning around really fast, like I was in the spin cycle of a washing machine. And then I found myself sitting on a table in a white room that appeared to circle around me. There were machines that looked to me at the time like vending machines. We didn't know about computers back then, but later I came to realize that's what they looked like. A man dressed in white pointed at the machines and asked me what I wanted. "I want a hamburger," I said. Yeah, I know how funny that sounds, but that's what I told him, and a hamburger popped out of one of the chutes. I don't remember eating it. The man stuck me in the arm with a needle, and the next thing I remember, he was showing me around the ship. We were standing at a long curving window, and I realized we were not on Earth anymore. We were speeding through space. We stopped in midair, and I found myself looking at these tall twin buildings in a place I'd never heard of. He said there were going to be changes on Earth, but he didn't elaborate on what those changes were going to be. Mostly, he warned me of my predicament. He said that I would have to change myself because the life I was living had no future. I don't remember anything after that. The next morning, I was back in my own bed. I thought about that dream and how real it felt. At 3 p.m., I headed to work, and as I drove down the road where I had seen the craft in my dream, I thought to myself, this is where it happened. And then I looked up into the sky, and there it was again. It had a bright silver bottom that sparkled in the sunlight, and as I watched it, it shot straight up into the clouds and out of sight. I only trusted a few people enough to share this story with in the past, and then only because they had shared with me something that had happened with them. The more UFO stories I hear, though, the more I realize the UFOs are getting bigger and bigger, like motherships coming down to Earth. I don't know what's going to happen to us, but it's getting to be a bit scary to think about. After that first dream, I've had several experiences when I would wake up in the middle of the night feeling as if I were being pulled up to the ceiling. It was so scary, and I would think, Jesus, help me, just help me. And then I would float back down to my bed and feel loving hands rubbing my face. That's no joke, it really happens. I don't think all of these alien creatures are evil, but I know these last ones trying to abduct me felt evil. No, I'm not insane, nor am I out there as some people call it. I have several degrees in various technical courses, and I managed my own business for years. And though I am retired now, I still try to get out and work as much as I can. I built my own house by myself, and it looks amazing. The funny part is that I built it in a Bigfoot hotspot. I've caught them on my game cameras, and I have many casts of their footprints. My life has been a really amazing story. Thank you for reading it. All right. One long story in this video. I pulled this up yesterday, and I thought, man, this is a great story. I've got to share this story. I've had it for a long time. I just am now getting to it. The title is, I Met a Strange Little Man in the Woods. It's not going to sound like a Bigfoot story right out of the gate, but just hang on because it's really good. He writes, Cam, please don't use my name. You'll find out why later in this story. In 1969, I was 12 years old. My parents owned a river cabin on a very remote section of the Natchez River in what is called the Big Thicket. The Big Thicket is a name given to a region of heavily forested area of southeast Texas. We spent our summers away from my hometown in Beaumont, Texas, on that very beautiful but rustic river. In the spring of 1969, my best friend Tim and I decided to save our money and purchase a 2-man GI surplus rubber raft. We had great dreams and discussions of how we would fish all day from our own raft. We worked all spring and summer, mowing yards and collecting bottles to earn money. And finally, in midsummer, we had saved the $31 for the raft. We asked Tim's father to take us downtown to the GI surplus to finally buy our raft. Let me say that the raft lived up to our expectations. We rode that thing all over the river, fishing and swimming from our own personal 2-man survival raft. We had tons of fun, and the feeling of accomplishment was the absolute best. It was a great summer. The raft represented our freedom and our own ability to provide something special for ourselves. One day toward the end of summer and before school started, we were staying up at the cabin, but Tim wasn't with us. I decided to go up early, and I got out fishing in the raft. My dad always insisted that we row upriver so that no matter what, the current would bring us home. My dad was a wise man and a great outdoorsman. I was always smart to follow his advice. I stuck near the shore when rowing because the current wasn't as strong near the sandbars. While rowing upriver that morning, I passed a sandbar that I was familiar with. We had fished from it and swam off of it. We called it our secret sandbar. I don't know why, but back then everything had to have a name. And it was a great place to seine for minnows for bait, but on that warm summer morning, I noticed something different. There was a long, thick black rubber hose that was partially covered and coming out of the woods behind the sandbar, and it trailed down into the river. That was odd, I thought. I've never seen that before. Being 12 years old and very curious and too young to be alarmed, I rowed to shore and pulled the raft up on the sandbar and decided to investigate the origin of the mysterious hose. Perhaps I should have gone back to the cabin and gotten my dad or my older brother, but I was too eager to know where the hose was coming from. Walking alone in the woods didn't concern me at all because I did it every day when I was at the cabin, so off I went into the thicket to investigate. I walked 50 yards into the woods and the whole time carefully following the hose. I noticed that the hose was jumping a little like it was pumping water from the river. This was just getting more and more interesting. I came upon a metal box that the hose was connected to, and then it split into two hoses that veered off in two directions but not far apart. I followed the hose further until I heard a noise up ahead in the woods like someone hammering on a pipe. I kept following the hose until I saw something in the distance and it didn't fit. And I crept a little closer and I was stunned when I saw sitting there in the woods an object that looked like a small submarine. Well, I stopped and stared and went into Indian Daniel Boone squirrel hunter mode. And I quietly snuck up a little further and saw a little man wearing a jumpsuit and a hard hat working on some type of equipment out in front of the submarine thing. I could now see that it was larger than I first realized. What was I looking at? I was a naive kid, so I yelled, "Hey!" The little man looked up at me and stared and then looked behind him and said something to someone that I could not see. And then he said in a strange accent, "Are you alone, boy?" "Yes, sir, I'm following this black hose to see where it goes." "It leads right here," he said. "I'm using the hose to pump water to cool some equipment I'm working on. How did you get here?" I told him that I rowed to the sandbar in my rubber raft, and then things got interesting. What happened next I'll never forget as long as I live. The little man, who was shorter than me, stopped working and came over to me, and he reached out and patted my shoulder and said, "What's your name, boy?" I told him my name and asked him his. I don't remember his name, but it wasn't one of the usual names I had heard before. I asked him what the little submarine was doing in the woods, and he turned and looked at it and laughed. "Boy, this isn't a submarine. Have you ever seen a submarine in the woods before?" he asked. It was silvery gray, like a submarine, and tubular shaped with a porthole and a hatch door opened on the side. It was 30 to 40 feet long at my best guess. "What is it?" I asked. "It's a re-entry vehicle," he said. "A what?" "It's a flying ship for space travel," he said. "You mean like Apollo?" I asked. "Kind of like that," he said, "but it doesn't have rockets like your Apollo craft." And then I realized the little man was pulling my leg. "What is a spaceship doing out here in the woods on the Natchez River?" I asked, smiling. "I'm a transfer agent, and I'm in the process of transferring my resource into a salt cave far under the surface of this forest." Well, I had no idea what he was talking about. And then the little fellow told me that he was hungry, and he asked if I'd like to eat with him. I hadn't had breakfast, so I asked, "Well, what do you have?" He offered some fruit and some dark bread. The fruit was kind of like grapes, but yellow, and the bread was thick and very tasty. He said he liked our butter, but he didn't have any. "What do you mean, our butter?" I asked. We sat down to breakfast, and he started to tell me a far-out story. And by the way, the yellow grapes were the best fruit I have ever eaten in my life. He said to me, "You look like a smart boy, and what I'm about to tell you, you have to keep a secret. If you tell it, no one's going to believe you anyway." I should have listened to him and kept my mouth shut, but more about that later. And this is what he told me. "I am one of 1,600 transfer agents stationed on this beautiful blue planet. I am assigned to the petroleum division, and my job is to transfer crude petroleum into various places into underground caves in Texas and Louisiana. There are 113 of us petroleum agents assigned to this planet. The other agents are not in my division. They transfer other resources such as water, salt, plants, animals, precious metals, chemicals, and other needed resources to and from this world of yours. We transfer the resources mostly from the other planets in our solar system. The plants and animals come from places far away." And he went on to say that our water originally came from the red planet, and now it comes from the rings of Saturn. Our salt comes from Mercury, and our petroleum and sulfur come from Venus. Most of our metals come from Uranus and Pluto, and some transfer agents continually test our oceans for the correct salinity balance, and when needed, salt is transferred from Mercury. He said that when water is corrupted, it is removed and replaced with fresh water, and that this process goes on continually, but more recently since there had been a fast rise in our population. "It's our job," he said, "to make sure the blue planet never runs out of what is needed for mankind." I asked if the oil is brought in his spacecraft. "Good question," he said. "The best way to explain it is like this. We transfer on and off planet through another dimension. The resource is changed into a non-physical quintessence and then transferred to where it is assigned and then changed back into its physical form. If we couldn't do it that way, we couldn't do it at all." "Well, who do you work for?" I asked. "Do you work for Mobil or Texaco?" "Oh, you're a smart boy," he said. "I cannot tell you who I work for, but if you think very hard, you will figure it out." "Well, why can't you just tell me?" I asked. "That's the one bit of information that I can't share with you," he said. "Well, do you work for God?" I asked. He only stared at me and said, "All I can say is that he comes from a physical realm and that the transfer agents are assigned by very wise and affectionate authorities." I asked him how much he gets paid to do his job. He laughed out loud in his funny little voice and he said, "I'm getting paid right now by getting to visit with you." Well, I wasn't sure what he meant, but it made me feel good. The little man turned and said something in a different language behind him and toward the vessel. So I looked behind him and I saw something that I had not seen before. There, in front of the craft, stood a large, hairy, man-type animal. I have since figured out that it was a Bigfoot. At the time, I thought it was an ape, but it didn't stoop over like an ape, and it had a face with a nose, and it had human-like eyes. But this thing was huge. It was tall as the craft and looked at me in a way that scared me. Immediately, I jumped up and I said, "What is that thing?" The little man said, "This is a friend of mine. He's a forest guardian who makes sure no one comes around here to tamper with the transfer equipment." He then took me behind the craft and he showed me a Christmas tree, or that's what we call them in Texas. A Christmas tree in Texas is a stack of wellhead valves and adapters. It was like none I had ever seen, and I had seen many in my life, even at 12. Wellhead adapters were everywhere in southeast Texas. "This is where I transfer the resource into the ground and down to the salt caves below," he said. "Well, what does that big hairy fellow do?" I asked. The little man told me that he is here to guard this and other equipment so no one bothers it. He said there are many of them all over the country and all over the planet, that they are our friends who protect the transfer agent's equipment when we're not here. He went on to say that they are good at frightening people away who get too close to what they protect. They won't harm you, he said, unless you get too close to what they guard. These things are not from this planet, but they like it on the blue planet because they are left alone and there's plenty of food to eat. He also told me that they can cause a person to become very scared just by looking at them. The little guy then took me back to where we were eating, and he told me he had something for me. He went into his ship and brought out a box. He opened it, and inside was a small device the shape of what I can only describe as a small Mercury space capsule. He took it out and placed it in my hand. It was small, and it was made of metal like stainless steel. "What is it?" I asked. He told me that he wanted me to keep it, and as long as I had it with me, I would never be bothered by the forest guardian or by any one of the other more unfriendly visitors. "Well, who are the unfriendly visitors?" I asked. "There are creatures that visit this planet for much different reasons than the transfer agents," he said. "They're cruel and nasty little brutes who are up to no good. If you hang on to this little gift, they will never bother you." He then asked me to tell him about my family and friends and where I went to school and if I went to church. I chatted on about all the things that I was interested in: fishing, baseball, comic books, model airplanes, and hunting squirrels. I told him about how my friend Tim and I had saved up and bought the raft, and I told him about being a Boy Scout and an altar boy in the Catholic Church and that I attended Catholic school. He seemed to like hearing this, and he told me to always be especially good to my mother and my sister. I told him I had a gift for him, and I pulled a folded comic book from my back pocket. It was a Marvel comic of the Fantastic Four, and he smiled and thanked me and said that he would enjoy it. And then an alarm sounded, and the little man put on his hard hat, wrapped up his leftovers, and said he had to get back to work. He patted my shoulder again and said he enjoyed talking with me. He made me promise that I would not tell anyone about our conversation and to never let anyone see the small device that he had given me. I promised him I would keep our secrets, and I said goodbye. I waved at his big hairy friend, and then off I went back to my beached raft. I knew I would never forget the weirdest day of my whole life. The next school year, I was in the 7th grade and changed from a private Catholic school to public junior high. All my old friends were there too. My friend Tim would come a year later because he was a year younger than me. School was going great, but a problem started when we were assigned an English class to write a paper on what we did over the summer. I wrote about Tim and me buying the raft, and I stupidly wrote about meeting the little man in the woods. Yep, I wrote everything, including the part about the resources from the other planets and the big hairy man. I told about the submarine that turned out to be a spaceship and the food and all of it. I even told about the device the little man gave to me and that it would protect me. It was an 11-page report. I turned it in to Mrs. Beale and expected an A on my first assignment in junior high. Man, was I surprised 2 days later when I was called to the principal's office. I didn't even know who the principal was because I was a brand new student. Well, I went to the office during math class and I waited on the bench outside. And I was called in and was greeted by not only the principal, but also a man in uniform who was introduced to me as the local sheriff. I started to get scared because me and some buddies had recently been throwing rocks at hobos who were riding in open train cars over the tracks. I was sure the sheriff was there to arrest me for stoning hobos. That's not what they were concerned about, though. Mr. Newberry, my principal, opened his desk and pulled out my assignment from English class. I immediately began getting nervous and scared. Mr. Newberry asked, "Did you write these papers?" Thinking back, I should have said no. I should have said my brother wrote it, or I read the story in a comic book, or anything other than what I said. But being a good Catholic boy, I couldn't lie. "Yes, I wrote it. What's wrong with it?" I said. Mr. Newberry chimed in. "Daryl, you were supposed to write what you did over the summer, not a fantastic story about spaceships and big hairy monsters in the woods. Did you really buy a rubber raft? Yes, sir, I replied. It's in my garage right now, but it's deflated. Who is your friend Tim? Asked the sheriff. Well, I told all about Tim and that he was still in the 6th grade at St. Anthony's. The sheriff then asked if my parents had a cabin on the Natchez River. Yes, sir, I said. And right then, I should have asked to have my parents called in, but back then I was too stupid to know better. And then the sheriff asked me if I really did meet a little man in the woods. And this is where I finally snapped. No, I said, I made the whole thing up. And then the sheriff asked, have you ever seen a big hairy ape man in the woods on the Natchez River? No, sir, I made that up too, I said. Why did you make this story up, young man? Said Mr. Newberry. I thought fast. I don't know, I guess I had a boring summer and I wanted to write something interesting. And then the sheriff said, son, it's okay to tell us if you really did meet this little man. If you did, I'd like to thank you for writing the story and would like to see the device he gave you. Maybe you would be willing to sell it to me for $20. $20? Dang, I thought. $20. And then reason trumped my excitement. No, sir, I said, I made the whole thing up. The principal and the sheriff looked at each other, and then Mr. Newberry said, in the future, son, you should stick to the truth and not make up science fiction stories like this ever again. Then he told me that it had upset Mrs. Beale, and I promised I would stick to the truth, and then I was dismissed. I have a cousin who at the time was a captain in the Army. He flew helicopters in Vietnam. I'd even written a story about him in 6th grade as the person who was my greatest hero. I guess I shouldn't have written that story either. But out of the blue, and some weeks after my visit to the school principal, my cousin called and said that he was going to be in town that next Sunday. He asked if I'd like for him to take me to the Dairy Queen. Dairy Queen? Heck yeah! The next weekend, my cousin arrived at our house and visited with my parents, and then we drove to Dairy Queen. When we arrived at the DQ, there was an Air Force officer sitting at a booth in the back. We ordered sundaes, and then my cousin walked over to the Air Force guy and spoke to him. He then invited me to join them. Cool, I thought, an Air Force guy and an Army guy. This is awesome. When I joined them, I was introduced to the Air Force man who was a captain, and I asked what he flew, and he told me that he wasn't a pilot and that he was in Air Force intelligence. So you're a spy? I asked. He laughed and said, no, I only study reports. After visiting for a few minutes, the unexpected happened. The Air Force officer pulled out a briefcase, and he opened it and pulled out a copy of my English assignment. There it was again, my English assignment about what I did last summer. I became confused and scared. Daryl, you've written quite a story here. Can we talk about it? He asked. The conversation was quite different from the one I had with my principal and the sheriff. The Air Force guy told me that I was not the first person to have this type of experience, and that he believed that I really did meet the little man in the woods. He said they know there are big hairy ape men in the big thicket, and that he would like to know all that I could tell him. He asked me if I entered the spacecraft. Well, I made the mistake and said no, instead of saying I made it all up. He asked me if I still had the device, and I finally snapped and said no, that I made it all up, and he kept at it as if I was being interrogated. He said that it was my duty as an American and a Catholic Boy Scout to tell the truth and to let him see the device. Well, I'm not proud of what I did next. I was a tough kid, but I'd had enough, and I started crying. I mean, really sobbing. I guess I was just too stressed out to take any more. I felt betrayed by my cousin and by my English teacher and my principal. I wished I would have just kept quiet about the whole thing. I wanted to call my dad. Heck, I was only 12 years old and I was scared. I didn't like lying. I was in the depths of despair. I had never felt this stupid and upset with myself in my whole life. Why couldn't I have just written something else, I thought. And then something awesome happened. My cousin put his arm around me and pulled me close to him. And then he looked at the Air Force guy and he said, "That's enough. You're scaring the hell out of my little cousin. This meeting is over." The Air Force captain didn't respond. He got up and he walked out. I was sad for two reasons. First, for having to answer yet again to some unknown person in uniform about my English assignment, and two, I didn't get to eat my ice cream sundae. My cousin is still alive. He is a retired Army colonel. He is still my hero and has never asked again about my story. I've never said another word about it. And today, I'm in my 60s and I'm no longer afraid. I have not had another encounter with a Bigfoot or the strange little man in the woods. I still have the little device. I guess it's kept me safe. I'll never know for sure. Even now, I have a copy of my original English assignment. That's another story. And yes, I've completely figured out who the little man and all the other transfer agents work for. This long ago experience has shaped my life and my beliefs. I don't worry about things other folks fret over. I know that we will not be left to starve or run out of clean water or any other wonderful necessities that we enjoy on this beautiful planet we call home. I know that we are loved and provided for, and yes, even protected. I also know that all those Bigfoots you are always talking about are here for a good reason. And one more thing. Over the years, I have remembered other things the strange little man in the woods told me. Do not be afraid to believe in what your parents taught you about someone up above. Also, the strange little man taught me roughly 10 or so things that would ensure my success in life. They sounded silly at the time, but I started taking those things seriously 25 years ago. They've worked out extremely well. Please do not share my contact information. I said I'm not scared anymore, but the last thing I want is to be visited again. Thanks for giving us folks who have had unusual experiences a voice. Cam, I love your stories, and some even sound true. What about yours, dude? What about yours? He writes, "I love you, man. I'm one of your people." Well, I'm one of your people too, sir. And I don't know. I did a story yesterday called Bigfoot and the Monster in Me. It's actually an email I got, and I got this one. I'm just kind of going through a phase where I'm drawn to these really strange stories, and a lot of people think I should kind of brush those aside. Now, I will say, I do get some that are so outlandish that I know that the writer's trolling me. There's no doubt in my mind, and I'll trash those. But you can tell by what I just read, I don't just throw away, stories that just seem outrageous. This man is quite believable. I cannot attest to the truth or non-truth of this story, but he spent a heck of a lot of time writing this thing, and it's a great story, and I actually believe him. I don't know. Now, that doesn't mean I necessarily believe that the Bigfoots are space creatures that are put here to protect wellheads and things like that. I don't know. I don't even want to try to figure all that out. It's just such a deep subject. I kind of like keeping all of these theories kind of bouncing around in my head. I watched Carrie's 168 Hours last night and this morning, and he's making the case that the Bigfoot, you cannot get a good image of them. It's just impossible to get a good image. I don't know about that, but that's a theory that I like bouncing around in my head. That's a different idea that I've actually never heard before. I always thought people were just taking pictures and finding dark objects behind green foliage and just you can do that with clouds. You can look up at a cloud and you can make it look like anything. You can make it look like a dinosaur or a dog face or a razorback. I've done that all my life. And you can do the same thing in the woods through a blurry picture. Anyway, but I enjoy the possibility of all these theories. They're fantastic. This particular story is the theory that Bigfoot are alien and that there are actually entities from other solar systems in the universe visiting our planet and supplying our planet with the resources that we need to survive and even thrive. So it was fascinating to me. The guy's a good writer, and there's your story. All right. If y'all hear a little rumble going on during this podcast, that's my wife out running the lawnmower in our yard. She's a peach. She said she wanted to cut grass, so I said, you go for it, girl. Here is an email written by a woman who doesn't want to reveal her name, but here's what she writes, and this is so good. She writes, I'm 83 years old, and I listen to your podcast with my daughter. Doing so has triggered a memory of a story my father used to tell. What he encountered was a mystery to him, but he never forgot it. In 1933, he was 20 years old and living on an exceptionally large farm between Lenoir and Blowing Rock in the foothills of North Carolina with his mother and father. He was the oldest of 8 children. My mother, who was 19 at the time, and the youngest of 10 children, lived 10 miles away on the next farm over with her mother. My mother's father had died just before she was born. So to make ends meet, my grandmother had turned their big home into a boarding house. At the time, my parents were courting and making wedding plans. On the hot summer night in question, my father had stayed later than he usually did. He had lost track of time as they planned out their future nuptials. In those days, there was no electricity in that area, and the roads were all dirt. Anyone who has been in the mountains at night knows there's nothing quite as dark as the darkness that falls on the mountains. My father had a long walk home, and for navigation he only had the stars that he could see between the branches of the trees that lined the road and formed the canopy overhead. At 6'2", my father was a big man who was not afraid of anything. Like most men of that era, he was used to hunting and spending time in the woods. He'd made it to within about a half a mile from home when he began to hear something following him. It came up alongside him, and he could clearly tell it was something on 2 feet. It was too dark to see what it was, but he said he would take a step and it would take a step. He would walk and it would walk, and when he stopped, it would stop. My father said he knew it could not be a panther or a bear because they both walk on all fours. He was just as sure it wasn't a man, and he kept thinking, what is this? He didn't have a gun on him, so he felt a bit helpless, and he dared not run, not knowing what it was. He only knew it was very big. He kept walking, and this thing kept pace with him the whole way, just a few feet away. He was unnerved, but did not want to show the fear that he felt. Up ahead, he could see the lights of his family's home in the distance. There was a fenced-in pasture in front of the house that he normally would have avoided. There were a lot of cattle in the pasture, and with them was a big, mean bull. For that reason, he would normally stay on the road and walk around the pasture and across the creek. This night, as soon as my father reached the fence, the thing let out a blood-curdling scream, and that was enough to make him run. He jumped the fence and crossed the pasture with lightning speed, not stopping until he reached the front porch. As he ran, he thought, where are my coonhounds? Where are my hunting dogs? They usually ran out to greet him, and they weren't afraid of anything, but on this night they were nowhere to be found. This scared him even more. He knew whatever this thing was, it must be bad to keep the dogs from coming out. He was finally getting close to the porch, but he couldn't see the first step because it was so dark. Well, he took a guess and took them 2 at a time until he was at last standing on the wide veranda. That's when he heard the dogs. They were up under the house whimpering. He looked back and he couldn't see anything, but he knew it was still there. He quickly stepped inside as if nothing had happened. He didn't want to frighten his family, nor did he ever tell them about it. Through the years, though, he would occasionally tell us the story. He didn't know anything about Bigfoot, but I was warned as a child not to go into the woods at night because there were boogers out there. He said he never again stayed too late while courting my mother. He always made sure he left well before it got dark. We have often wondered what it could have been that my father encountered. After listening to the stories of other people's accounts on your channel, I really do believe it was a Bigfoot that walked along the road with him that dark summer night in 1933. My father's father had his own tale to tell. It's shorter and a bit funny. He also never said anything about believing in Bigfoot, but he did believe in woolly boogers. My grandfather's story took place in 1912 in the Mortimer area of North Carolina. It was another dark night and another dark road. As with my father, he was looking up through the overhead branches at the night sky for guidance. I guess that's just what they did back in those days. My grandfather described the night as so dark he couldn't see his hand in front of his face. That fact, combined with the fact that he was looking up, is probably why he didn't see it. And out of nowhere, he stumbled over something. He was unable to regain his balance and he fell, landing right on top of something large and furry. It was a huge animal that was lying in the road. Too dazed and shocked to move, he just sat there until the creature swatted him away like a pesky fly. Then, to his amazement, it got up and walked off, like a man. When telling the story, he would always assure us that it was not a bear, and he didn't know what it was. And he would finish the story each time with this quote, "But it was huge, let me tell you." I'm a former active duty Marine Corps sergeant. Once a Marine, always a Marine. Just not in as good a shape as I was then. In the winter of 1997, I was only a Lance Corporal, or an E3, mountain training in Northern California. We'd been training for weeks, getting physically acclimated to the mountainous terrain, the higher altitude, and cold weather, but most of us were in good spirits. It was almost over. Our last training evolution was ambush training. We were to set up and wait for the other half of our class. We were to ambush them and they were to defend our foe attack. We were set up in two-man groups, set 20 meters apart just inside a tree line opposite a little valley that acted like a choke point. We all dug in with interlocking fields of fire and distances mapped out. Man, we were ready. The hardest part of the exercise is always to hurry up and wait. It allows for too much speculation. When are they coming? Did they discover us and decide to flank us? Or are they just going to try and sneak past? The mind wanders when you know it's just training. And soon we took turns in our two-man fighting positions of 1 hour on and 1 hour off watches so we could get some rest since we had been up for a long time at that point. This game took place from 2100 to 0300. That's 9 p.m. to 3 a.m. for any civilian timekeepers who might be wondering. At 0 hours, several of us heard a loud snap coming from about 100 yards in front of us across the ravine. It sounded like a tree had been quickly and efficiently snapped in two. I rustled my fellow Marines awake. The time to hurry up and wait was past, and we could get this evolution over. Soon we would be all warm and dry and sleeping comfortably. Let's get this done. With our M16A2 rifles fitted with BFAs, blank firing apertures, and mags loaded with blanks at the ready, we waited silently to lay fake waste to the fake enemy. We didn't have fancy night vision goggles and optics back then, so we were operating by the nicely lit star-filled sky. We heard another snap and made ready. Next we heard something crunching through the snowpack across the valley. We were getting itchy on the trigger to get this over with as we had all waited and focused on the silence. We were trying to pinpoint where the sound had come from, but we still had no visual on the enemy. As we watched for signs of movement, a loud, deep, angry-sounding roar erupted from the far side of the little valley. It occurred to several of us that this might not be the enemy that we were expecting. It was like no other animal we'd ever heard. It had such a deep bass that we could literally feel the sound resonate through our bodies. It must have seen or smelled us. My fellow Marine and I looked at each other with "what the hell was that" written all over our faces. Our radio came alive telling us to regroup and pack it in. We were confused because we thought that we were finally going to get into the action, but we quickly and quietly moved out and back to the training class site. The next day we did a patrol and assessed the area. The opposite side of the little valley was steep and shaded out by trees, which is why we heard the noise, but couldn't see anything. We soon found huge footprints in the hard-packed snow. I'm 6'3" and I weigh 190 pounds. I could barely crunch down into the snow more than a couple of inches. These tracks were easily packed down 8 inches deep or more. I estimated them to be 16 to 18 inches long and 8 inches wide. As we stared at the prints, our normal banter stopped and we fell silent. We were stunned, not just by the size of the prints, but the distance between them. Whatever this thing was, it had a stride of 6 to 7 feet. The tracks led into the tree line where we could no longer see them. We asked the trainer if we could follow the trail, but tracking something not on the training schedule was not permitted, no matter how much we begged to do it. As the class wrapped up, some of the rowdier, less tactful Marines were already mouthing off about it being a Bigfoot. Well, that was my thought too. We were all told that we didn't see anything, nor did we hear what we thought we heard. That seemed odd, but I didn't question it. I just followed orders. However, as military guys will do, we all discussed it among ourselves and came to the consensus that we all heard and saw the tracks of a Bigfoot. Even though we didn't actually see it, the guttural roar and the tracks convinced us that's what it had to be. I was honestly never scared, nor were any of my fellow Marines. Mostly we were just curious and amazed. I'm guessing the overwhelming fear that people experience is from actually seeing it and not from distant noises. To this day, I fully believe that the source of those sounds and prints was the ever-elusive Sasquatch. I have also come to the conclusion that our training was stopped because our training staff heard it from their position. Maybe they knew something that we didn't. Maybe they were used to being around and knew better than to mess with it. Stay vigilant and Semper Fi. We are a group of scientists and educators from Australia, France, Germany, Poland, Russia, and the United States who are dedicated to the search for truth in science and education on the subject of origins of life. Some of us locally in Columbus, Ohio, have been interested in Bigfoot, alias Sasquatch, and then he goes through a few names here that, anyway, I'm not going to do those, for many years. So as a volunteer director of the International Paleochronology Group, I want to make sure these reports receive public attention. So I'm sending them to Nance of Ohio Bigfoot and to Dixiecryptid. Both of you have exchanged emails, so you are aware of each other's programs. Here are the 6 encounters located in Central Ohio as reported to me or to my son, Kevin Miller. We vouch for the sincerity of our relatives, neighbors, and friends who related these stories to us, and we appreciate very much your efforts that encourage folks with encounters and or friends and relatives to tell their stories. Okay, just hang with me here. I've already talked to Nance, and she was kind of unclear on whether she had done this one or not. So if you guys have heard this before, just click away. I don't know if she's done it or not, but it's pretty interesting. So again, this is not the typical story that I read them, but we'll just keep going with it. Our list of 6 sightings in Ohio and many encounters by one person in Pennsylvania, unreported or unknown by BFRO, are as follows. Here's the first one, for which I was told to by a cousin, Thomas Ewing, now deceased when he was the sheriff of Heath, Ohio in Licking County. This sighting occurred in 1975 in Pataskala, Licking County, Ohio, probably Summit Road, probably Summit Road, a north and south road that crosses Route 16 that is an extension of Broad Street, a main east-west street running across Columbus to Heath in Newark, Ohio, about 20 miles away east. Summit Road is about 20 miles from downtown Columbus, Ohio, in Franklin County, with a population of 500,000 in 1975. Pataskala, I don't know what that word is, Pataskala, Pataskala police were called to investigate a very serious report by two teenage girls, possibly sisters, who were returning from roller skating when they first smelled a terrible odor like Limburger cheese. Whew. They then saw a very tall, huge, hairy bipedal creature cross a set of railroad tracks and then stepped over a rail or farm fence into an open field of high grass. They ran home and were so visibly shaken that the parents phoned the police, who came at once and made a report. The next day, they returned and checked the immediate area and found brownish hair on a barbed wire fence, which they sent to London, Ohio, to a forensics lab. A large area of grass had been matted down in the grassy field. According to the chief of police of Heath, Ohio, Thomas Ewing, who talked with the local police, was told that the lab could not identify the hair under the microscope, but described it as hollow and somewhat between a deer and a bear, nothing that they had examined or was in their exhibit file of many types of hair, including man-made. My cousin and I attended a UFO conference in Dayton, Ohio shortly after the incident, where they also discussed Bigfoot sightings. I eventually met up with a Bigfoot investigator in Cincinnati who had been investigating encounters in Kentucky and southern Ohio, and learned that he had cataloged many sightings in southern Ohio and Kentucky. My list and some others were emailed to BFRO about a year or so ago, but to my knowledge, they were not reported, as I was never a witness. Here's encounter number 2. I'm not even going to comment on these, I'm just going to read them. Number 2, this encounter occurred in Canal, Winchester, Fairfield County, Ohio, about 15 miles from downtown Columbus, Ohio, in the fall of 1969 or 1970. Jan S., research physicist, a fellow scientist and friend, now age 64, was helping his parents move into their new home when he heard what appeared to him to be an angry howl coming from the adjacent clump of trees, after which he heard something move rapidly through a cornfield, breaking corn stalks as it ran. The howls were so unusual and loud that he remembers them to this day, when he told me after I had mentioned several stories. It was as if the unknown creature did not want them there. He later heard a few days later that there was a Bigfoot sighting in southern Ohio. Jan told of this encounter after I told him the encounter by the two girls from Licking County about 2017. Okay, here's number 3. When I told my next-door neighbor, Mr. Van Cullen, about 1975 of the Licking County sighting by the teenage girls, he told me of his sightings in a previous year. He and a friend were returning home by car from a southern Ohio deer hunting trip when they both saw a huge hairy bipedal creature running across an open harvested cornfield from one clump of trees to another. My neighbor, who was driving, asked his friend, "Did you see that?" His friend said, "Yes, I did. Keep driving." All right, here's number 4. A young man who was a student at Nazarene College of Mount Vernon, Knox County, Ohio, in 2015 told my son, Kevin Miller, without any discussion of Bigfoot offered, about his encounter, as if he just had to tell someone. He was driving with a friend on a winding road when he came around a turn and saw in his headlights a hairy beast squatting in the road ahead. It got up quickly and easily walked bipedally up a steep slope, and then into the brush on top, as easy as we would walk on flat ground. This is almost identical to a sighting in Licking County in 1975 on the BFRO website. Kevin thinks that he would be reluctant to talk about it, but lives just 2 doors from Kevin's home. All right, here's a comment the writer makes about story number 4. I think it interesting that the BFRO reports showed many reports in north to south line of such counties as Ashland, Richland, Knox, Licking, Fairfield, Hocking, Ross, Pike, from north to south, similarly as observed in eastern Ohio, for the Bigfoot called the Grassman. Thus, this could be just another ancient pathway or trail that some Bigfoot families follow, but through the hilly countryside east of Columbus. There are hundreds of caves and caverns in Ohio, with only 6 open to the public, so with old barns and coal mines, there are plenty of living quarters in the winter. Another example, Alabama has over 4,000 caves, and lots of Bigfoot sightings also. Okay, here's number 5. My grandson, John of Pataskala, Ohio, in Licking County on the eastern edge of Franklin County, 20 miles from downtown Columbus, told me of his possible encounter in Pataskala, just off the north-south Summit Road on Old Main Road, where a famous former governor of California has a second home with many other homes on one side and a forest on the other. This encounter occurred about 2013 when John was 15. It was within 5 miles of the sighting by the 2 girls. John and a friend were out late one night to visit a friend on Old Maid Road, about a mile from John's home, when they heard a presumably large animal howling in such a way from the woods as to seemingly disguise its voice as if it was an owl. They both looked at each other immediately as the strongest chill to ever run down their spines filled them with terror. By the time of the second howl, which followed in 2 to 4 second intervals for the next 10 minutes, simultaneously, they both started sprinting back down Old Maids Road the way they had come from. Each howl sounded less and less like an owl as the beast became less shy and put bass in its screeching yells. The beast continued to howl until they were just about at John's home. They know it was no owl because the noise sounded far too deep and heavy to be coming from a creature smaller than themselves, let alone an owl. Okay, that was number 5. Here's number 6. This incident occurred in Ross or Pike County, southern Ohio, near, I'm not even going to try this one, Chillicothe, Chillicothe, Ohio. I am a U.S. Army veteran and was wearing my Bigfoot cap when I visited the Wiley, Virginia Clinic for Blood Work in early 2019. The young lady nurse named Lindsay, who was assigned to take a blood sample, remarked, "I like your cap." Having just heard of my grandson's experience a few weeks earlier, I laughingly replied, "Have you heard a Bigfoot howl?" She said, "No, but I saw one." She continued, "I was driving home about 3:30 a.m. from Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia, and was about 15 minutes from my home when this huge hairy creature ran across the county road on 2 legs, just 15 feet in front of my car. I saw it clearly in my headlights, and it was about 8 feet tall. When I got home, I was so scared I left the car door open and ran in to tell my parents. My father believed me, but my mother was skeptical. I will never forget it. I think this encounter scarred her, as she would not come to the BFRO lectures that we invited her to attend with us. All right, here's number 7. Northeast Pennsylvania, near the top of a 15-foot high hill in the 1990s, before and after. First, the background, which sets the stage for this and other encounters by Jacob, who made it clear to me that he does not even want the location known for fear of hunters invading his favorite outdoor haunts with an idea of hunting down a Bigfoot. He wants them to be free and safe. This is how I learned of Jake and his encounters. He phoned me to explain who he was and the two human-like footprints he had found embedded in Mississippi geologic formation, allegedly over 300 million years old in 1999 on a small creek bank near the top of a hill or mountain. He had taken this loose rock to an anthropologist at Penn State University, and the professor granted that they were made by humans. When told their location, he said, "That can't be," and refused to talk any more about what he just saw. This was of great interest to me, as our team had made many trips to Glen Rose, Texas, to participate in excavating dinosaur footprints and human-like footprints together under 12 inches of Cretaceous limestone and 3 inches of clay. There is an article entitled "Jacob's Mother and Child Print" by Doug Wilder, a biologist and one of our IPG members, in which he cites the scientific evidence for the validity of these footprints. In a meeting a few years later in his Pennsylvania hometown, Jake also told of a Bigfoot he encountered while camping out in a tent near the top of the same mountain. He was in his tent for the night with his nephew when something brushed the outside of the tent fabric. He opened the tent flap. Walking upright away from the tent about 50 feet away was a giant 10-foot-tall hairy bipedal creature with glaring red eyes and fangs looking back at him. In the winter, in an opening in the same forest, he also saw Bigfoot tracks after a winter snow. There were 2 sets of very large human-like prints side by side and intermittently much smaller ones between, as if 2 adults were lifting an offspring up and down that was between them. He also told me in a phone conversation in 2019 that he had seen smaller ones about 6 feet tall peering around the trees watching him. He ignored them but observed them from the corner of his eye in the same forest. This is an abandoned coal mine, one of many and old foundations of small coal mining town of 1,500 people that was abandoned on top of that hill. Jacob is a woodsman and saw his first Bigfoot at age 15, standing next to a stop sign. It quickly moved back into the forest on 2 legs when it saw him and a friend. When the height of the sign was measured, he and his friend estimated that the beast was 8 feet tall. And when he told his older brother what they had seen, his brother was skeptical. So Jake's older brother said, "I want you and your friend to draw what you both allegedly saw now." And when they drew the pictures, they were identical, and so elder brother became a believer, but never saw any himself, as he was not an avid woodsman. All right, let's see here. Here's one from Uganda he has in this letter. I'll try to read this one. Uganda on the west coast of Africa. When I attended an international meeting on the origin of life in northern Kentucky in June of 2019, I was talking to a friend who was an aeronautical engineer and a Bigfoot skeptic about the many encounters that I've heard about, when one of the attendees listening to our conversation suddenly interrupted and said with great emphasis, "We have them in Uganda too. They're big and tall," as he raised one hand way above his head. I think my friend was at least momentarily stunned and was one surprised guy myself. Needless to say, I was delighted with my newly found friend from Uganda. So much for skepticism. Bigfoots, for whatever reason, are called elsewhere. Bigfoots, for whatever they are called elsewhere, are indeed worldwide, as we now know. And then he goes on with, there's a lot of his commentary under here. I'll just read the first bit of it. Thus, there's good reason to say that Bigfoot is an elusive giant ape-like bipedal creature. Strangely, there are far more depictions and stories about dinosaurs living with man than Bigfoot with man. The AD 986 report by Leif Erikson's team of explorers is one of the few good written ancient reports that we have, but no Bigfoot drawings came with it. It is said most of the native tribes across North America have stories in their oral traditions describing giant hairy figures that look and behave very similar to what many Americans and Canadians have described over the past few centuries. Bigfoot is indeed controversial, just as dinosaur depictions, and have been made controversial by skeptics and those folks whose religious beliefs tell them that we are all descended from a common bacterial ancestors 600 million years ago. But that belief has been more than challenged by the existence of soft tissue in some dinosaur bones. By C14 dating testing of all bones of 20 dinosaurs in the thousands of years and depictions of dinosaurs by our ancestors in the past 500 to 5,000 years on every continent with dinosaur and human-like footprints together in Texas, and also worldwide sedimentary strata like Cretaceous and Jurassic. Could some be Bigfoot prints, as there is a short trail of one that is 22.5 inches long in Texas, uncovered under tons of limestone? There are many myths and legends about gorillas in Africa before they were fully discovered to be just another animal. Based on our studies of dinosaur depictions worldwide, C14 dating of their bones, fossil human and dinosaur footprints together, and our collection of sightings and howls of alleged Bigfoot, we conclude with BFRO and other collectors of sightings like Dixiecryptid and Ohio Bigfoot and Buckeye Bigfoot videos that 1. They do exist but in small numbers, as BFRO etc. suggest. Maybe several thousand nationwide of the giant ones. However, according to he gives a YouTube link here, the estimate is now 15,000 in upper North America alone. Jeff Meldrum was in this video, but he did not give that estimate. But Jeff believes he had a night encounter with one, his first on this Canadian expedition in 2013 that just came to light in December of 2019. Okay, that's number one. Number 2, they seem to be very intelligent. Don't bother us and we won't bother you. Number 3, they seem to be curious of us as we are of them, but they have their dangerous ones just like we humans have ours. When they howl close by, it's like a warning. Move on. Therefore, they seem to be courteous to a point, but very scary and not lovable. Okay, there's a couple of more of these points, and I'm just, you all have heard, if you follow the Bigfoot thing, you've heard all of those theories, and I agree with them. The reason I did this and put it at the end of the video was because the man sent it to me. He spent a lot of time writing this. I wanted to get it out. It doesn't really follow the storytelling, theme that we do here, but I just felt like I needed to get it up for him, for Mr. Miller, Hugh Miller. So, Mr. Miller, I'm sorry it took me so long to do this. I just couldn't figure out how to present it. So I finally just did it. I just read it and I stumbled through it. Your sentences are extremely long, but they're more, you're writing something that's like a court testimony more so than a story. And so it's a little bit different to read, but, and I'm not going to edit it. I'm not going to do anything with it. Just going to leave it like it is. So there you have it. Hugh Miller, International Paleochronology Group, Columbus, Ohio. Those are the encounters he wanted you to hear. Thank you, Mr. Miller. I was a young boy when this encounter took place, but I still think about it. It was late spring, and I was 7 years old. My father decided to take me to our favorite camping area in an isolated spot deep in the mountains of Trinity County, California. The campground has since burned in a forest fire and is no longer in use. Deep in the backwoods forest, there was a small prairie. Grouse Prairie, as it was called, was an enchanting place. You had to travel up an old service road and through logging roads to get there. A small creek came down the mountain and cut through the prairie, and we had camped there many times, and we were familiar with it. We arrived a little after 10 a.m. and began to set up our camp. Our dog came along on these camping trips. He was a big, thick-bodied black lab. The dog began making his rounds and scouting the campground and sniffing everything in sight. He was doing what dogs do. Once camp was up and after lunch, we went on a quick trek through the woods. Everything was fine for the first couple of hours until something changed in the air. The birds went quiet. The dog became uneasy. We were still a ways from the prairie area, but we trudged ahead, and a bit further down the trail, the air began to feel heavy, and Smokey, our dog, started growling. It wasn't until we made it into the prairie that the heavy feeling in the air became a feeling of being watched. And in the middle of that prairie, even though I felt creeped out, I stopped and I began taking it all in. It was beautiful. I scanned the edges of the woods, and in one area I saw a shadow of a large person hiding behind a tree. And I yelled out to the person. That got my father's attention, and he turned to see who I was calling to. But by then the shadow was gone. Then we heard it running and tearing through the trees. Well, I thought that was unusual, that something would make that kind of noise going through the woods. The dog's hackles went up and he pranced around the area sniffing and growling, but the rest of the afternoon was uneventful. The next day things were calm. My dad and I did some target practice in the morning, and then we went on another hike, sticking closer to camp this time. We returned around 5 p.m. and began making supper. While we ate, we could hear crickets and other critters in the distance. It was calm and it was pleasant. It was the perfect place to be in that moment. But like a light switch being flipped, the sounds of the woods went silent. I could hear the blood even flowing through my eardrums, it was so quiet. I watched Smokey low crawl like a bird dog creeping up on a covey of birds over to a thicket of brush by the creek. He looked like a razorback pig with all that hair standing up on his back. He stopped just short of where the thicket began, and he remained motionless and growling and shaking. Something was in there. Dogs don't do that for the hell of it. There was an odor now present about the area that made me want to gag, and my father stood up and armed himself with a pistol he carried in his vest. Smokey burst off into the brush, growling and huffing. That scared me more than anything. It let me know there was something in there. Dad moved to the brush thicket with his pistol in position. He was almost there when Smokey yelped and whimpered off in the brush. And then a weird roar I had never heard followed. I will never forget that sound. Smokey was hurt, and I doubted I would see him again. But what the hell was he fighting? Was it a bear? Maybe a big cat? Finally, the dog burst from the brush in midair, and it sailed several feet before hitting the ground. And it rolled and tried to right itself, but Smokey couldn't get up. Dad snatched me up by the collar, and he dragged me backwards to the truck. The tailgate was down, and the topper lid was open, and he threw me in there, all the while calling to the dog that had finally gotten on its feet and was limping toward us. Dad stood between the truck and Smokey and began firing into the brush until his pistol was empty. Smokey had made it to Dad by then, and by the collar, Dad drugged Smokey and threw him in the bed of the truck with me. And then he ran to the cab and came back with a shotgun, and he fired 3 more shots into the brush. He was now out of shells, and Dad slammed the truck bed shut and then sprinted to the cab. I heard the truck start, and then I felt the truck lurch forward and watched gravel sling out behind us, and we took off out of the campground, leaving all of our stuff there. There was a stretch of road we needed to traverse before climbing a hill that would take us out of the area, and it gave me time to watch out the back to see this thing step out into the clear. I could not believe it. There was a creature taller than any man I know, and it stood motionless, arms to its sides, and it watched as we left. I didn't know what it was back then, but I do now. It was covered in hair and had thick arms and legs, and I think my jaw hung open for an hour. It was the strangest thing I had ever seen. Just when the truck was about to take me out of that field of view, I watched it turn and walk away from the camp and into the creek, and then there was nothing but dust swirling behind the truck. We drove for 30 minutes, and finally my father stopped and came back to check on us. Smokey lay there beside me, panting. He was hurt. There was no way to know how bad. To my surprise, Dad said that we would be staying right there for the night. He wasn't going to leave all that gear in the woods. It had value, he said, and we would sleep here and then go back and get our stuff the next day. We were 5 hours from home here, so I guess it made sense. And I spent that night curled up with my dog in the front seat of that truck while Dad never slept, his pistol now reloaded and in his lap, and was ready for use if we had any further trouble. The next morning, I let Smokey out the door, and I was thrilled to see that he was walking and sniffing the area and peeing all over the place. It appeared that he would make it. Other than him moving a bit slower than usual, he was going to be okay. 30 minutes later, we arrived at the campsite once again. We sat in the truck and watched from a distance. Our gear was strewn about, and the site looked nothing like it had the day before, but Dad wanted to wait and watch and make sure the area was clear. Finally, he drove on down into the site, and he got out and he began gathering our stuff while Smokey and I stayed put. And while he dragged everything to the truck, I could see that it was all torn up. Even the cooler we had hung bear-proof lay on the ground and was broken into several pieces. Once everything was loaded, we left, and I was glad to get out of there. What a creepy place that area turned out to be after all those times we had camped there. The next day was Monday, and Dad called in to the Fish and Game people to report the incident. I heard him tell the person on the phone that a bear had attacked our campsite. Well, I knew it wasn't a bear, but I didn't say a word. Later that week, 3 men from the agency came to our house, and I listened while they spoke in the living room. They had visited the site, and I heard them specifically say that it was not a bear that had torn up our camp, and that they were sure my father knew that. Well, he didn't know it because he didn't see what I saw. He was driving. I was about to walk in the room and tell them what I had seen when I heard one of the men say, "It doesn't matter at this point what you saw, sir. What matters is that this will be classified as a bear attack no matter what, and we would appreciate it if you would leave it that way and not talk about it to anyone." Well, I couldn't see my dad in the other room, but I'm sure he must have had a confused expression on his face as he told them that he would keep it quiet. The discussion he had with my mother later was quite animated. Dad just could not understand what the hell was going on. But in the end, I suppose it didn't have a huge impact on his life. Not so much that he would pursue the truth as some sort of a crusade. Why would he do that? If they didn't want him talking about a bear tearing up our camp, so what? He went on with his life. For the next few days, I thought about that day in the woods and everything we had been through. The image of that creature is still as vivid today as it was the day it happened. And then there was the game and fish people and what I overheard them say, and it stayed on my mind for many days, and I finally decided not to say anything to my father. There were a few other reasons I kept silent on this, but mainly what would have been the point. It's now over 30 years later, and I'm finally revealing this thing that I have kept to myself all these years. It feels good to tell someone. Well, to tell many thousands at one time if you choose to share this story in a video. It's finally out. I was chased out of a campground by a Bigfoot. Every word is the truth. 2005, I was a 15-year-old growing up in southwestern Virginia. I've spent most of my life in the woods. I still love to be in nature. It's where I believe I have a stronger relationship with my Creator. I was sitting under some pines overlooking a deer trail on a cold morning. My uncle had a deer stand in an old tree in the same spot, and he'd killed a few deer from there. Because of that and the cold front that had come through the night before, I had a feeling something was going to happen. As I sat there with my old side hammer muzzleloader loaded and ready for any deer to walk by, I heard the distinct sound of something crunching through the leaves. I put my rifle to my shoulder in anticipation of the deer I knew was about to pop up over the hill. What came over the hill wasn't a deer. It was a man who looked to be in his 40s. Right away, I noticed he was wearing clothes that weren't from this era. He had on a flat-brimmed leather hat with metal buttons on the front for decoration. His coat was made with the fur turned to the inside, and his pants were the same with worn leather on the outside. His shoes were harsh-sole moccasins, and he carried a leather possibles bag, the bag muzzleloader hunters carry with everything they need inside. It was across one shoulder with a powder horn on his opposite shoulder. His rifle was longer than the Hawkins-style rifle I had. His hair was coarse and brown. His bright blue eyes sized me up from a face covered in a full graying beard. It was as if he had stepped through the mist from a distant past. He had a look of confusion on his face as he approached, but asked in a congenial voice if I had seen anything yet. Perplexed by the fact that someone was hunting the farm that I knew I had sold permission to hunt, I managed only a curt, "No." He took another minute to look me up and down, and I did the same to him. "Can I see your gun?" he asked. I handed it over and he passed his to me. He sat down and we each inspected each other's weapon with awe. Although his gun was longer than mine, it was lighter. More impressive to me than the gun was the man's appearance. I was amazed that someone was hunting in full mountain man apparel. Nothing he wore could have been as warm as my modern-day insulated clothing. It was a sight I never would have expected to see here in the Blue Ridge Mountains, but I thought he must be a man who wished to live in a different time. And this was his way of coming as close to that as possible. Still, I couldn't help but wonder at his reaction to me. Maybe he really was from a different time. He handed back our guns and he smiled at me as he stood up. I might have asked him a few questions, but at that moment we both heard the sound of a deer walking. "He's coming," the man said. Without another word, the man got behind me, and we both watched as a buck came over the hill. The man put his hand on my shoulder, and he told me to take a deep breath and squeeze the trigger. I did as I was told. Pop! It wasn't the boom of the rifle, just the pop of the percussion cap and the powder igniting. It was enough to send the buck running. The man's hand was still on my shoulder as I turned around to say something. The words died on my lips, though, as I looked around for him. He wasn't there. I could still feel his hand on my shoulder, but he just wasn't there. I jumped up, and as I did so, the weight of his hand fell away. I decided it was time for me to call it a day. I was confused and frightened, but I didn't feel he meant me any harm, so there was no need to run. I just walked home, reliving those moments in my head, wondering who he could have been or where he might have come from. When I got home, I put another percussion cap in the gun and fired. This time the rifle operated properly. I cleaned my gun and put it away. I never got the man's name, nor did I ever figure out where or when he may have come from, and I've never seen him again. I'm 30 now, and I haven't hunted that area since. Sometimes I think about going back just to see if he might be there. There are some old rock walls in that area said to be from the 1800s, though no one knows what they were for or who built them. I like to think they were his once. My father was a master sergeant in the Green Beret Special Forces. My parents were friends with their captain, and we would spend time with their family. Their house was located in a community in northwest Dade County called Palm Springs North. This area was the last development northwest of Dade County. To the west of there is nothing but woods and Everglades. While our parents played cards until late, their son Doug and I would ride our bikes all over the area, sometimes not getting home until after midnight. On July the 2nd, 1966, Doug and I went to the neighborhood convenience store for snacks. It was much too late for two 12-year-old boys to be out, but times were different then. We then rode back to a vacant lot on the lake close to Doug's house to grub out on the junk food. On the way there, I had spotted a huge white owl in a tree with large black oval-shaped eyes. It was so strange, and I had never seen anything like this. I could not take my eyes off it. Doug was way ahead of me, and he turned back asking if I was coming. I broke eye contact with the owl, and I yelled to Doug, yeah, I'm coming. And when I looked back for the owl, it was gone. We arrived at the vacant lot on the lake. It was a beautiful night. Stars carpeted the black sky. Not long after dropping our bikes, we saw a cylinder-shaped object glowing faintly across the lake. It appeared cylinder-shaped from our point of view, and at the time, neither of us had ever heard of or knew anything about UFOs. We had only seen them in old cheesy Martian movies. The object hovered over the trees with what appeared to be an electrical charge to it, and then it landed across the lake behind some trees, and the glowing stopped. It never made a sound. We had to see what this was. It was about 1 a.m., and two 12-year-old boys made the long ride around the lake to the area we thought the object landed. We lined up his parents' house across the lake, and we knew we were in the right spot. We only needed to find a way to that forest. Well, I knew this area. An old man in the neighborhood paid me to cut his grass, and I was here every week or so. Now I was thinking maybe this thing landed close to his house. The dirt road leading to his house came into view on my right, and we took it. The wooded area was dark, and I had trouble seeing the road. I actually didn't want to go further, but we pedaled on. And then I could see the road clearly, like the sun had come up. I was confused at the light. It didn't make sense, and it should not have been there. But I was thankful to be able to finally see where I was pedaling. Something was off about this, though. My last memory of the ride down the dusty road was a tingling sensation all over my body. I became dizzy, and I dropped the bike in the middle of the road. So did Doug. I remember standing straight up and looking ahead, and that's it. Doug was shaking me and telling me to wake up. I was laying on the ground. Sand was all over me like I had been rolling in it. Doug helped me up, and I saw it was almost daylight, and we were standing in the tall weeds of the vacant lot by the lake, our bikes laying beside us. Both of us, still groggy, dusted the sand off our clothes, and we walked our bikes back to Doug's house. Neither of us could ride. Before we got there, we saw a police car in the drive. Our parents noticed us walking in the street, and they came running. At first, they were happy to see us. Our mother smothered us with hugs, but they soon got hacked off at us. The usual questions followed, and we couldn't answer any of them, making our parents think that we were covering something up. Of course, we weren't, but how would we explain what had really happened? It was early Saturday morning, and when we got home, I went straight to bed, and I slept until Sunday morning. I never woke once, no dreams, no trips to the bathroom, solid sleep for over 24 hours. That weekend, I was supposed to cut that old man's yard, so I got up and I gassed up the mower. I was about to get on my bike and drag the mower over there, but I felt hungry. I went back inside and I found a note on the kitchen table in my mother's handwriting. It said that Mr. Shag had called and to forget about cutting his grass. I was disappointed because I wanted to make some money that day. I rode over to Mr. Shag's place, down the same dirt road where this incident happened, to see if he had fired me or maybe found someone to cut the yard cheaper. He was standing in the yard when I rode up. His lawn was black. Something had caught it on fire and burned that beautiful lawn down to nothing. We walked around the back and his healthy garden looked the same. "Who burned your yard up, Mr. Shag?" I asked. "Nothing burned it up," he said. "I woke up yesterday, I came out, and this is what I found. There was no fire. Reach down and grab a wad of that black grass and smell it." I did, and I expected to catch a strong, charred odor, but it had no odor at all. Something had just sucked the life out of everything green on that property. His yard started growing back that summer, but it was almost 2 months before he needed it cut again, and by the time I next cut his yard, I had forgotten about the entire incident. Mr. Shag talked about black grass and how long it had taken to grow back, and I had no clue what he was talking about. That bugged me for years after. I actually thought that he had become senile and was dreaming things up. 8 or 9 years ago, I was surfing through YouTube videos. I was always drawn to the UFO and alien videos. In one video, a man stated that many abductees report seeing a large white owl within hours before their abduction, and that clicked with me. The memories didn't come flooding back, but I remembered the owl that night. Piece by piece, that night's events came back to me over the next year. Some of those pieces fell into place in dreams. I finally remembered as much as I have written in this email, but that is all I can remember. I have been stuck here ever since. There are 4 or 5 hours missing, and I cannot find them. I'm on a dirt road surrounded by light. 5 hours later, I wake up with my buddy in an overgrown field of weeds and sand. It doesn't make sense. Doug and I stayed friends for years. It was not long after this incident that my family moved closer to Doug's house. Life went on, and we never spoke about it. It wasn't in either of our memories at the time. After he and I graduated and went off to school, I lost track of him, and I haven't spoken to him since. Throughout my adult life, I have suffered from anxiety. Neither can I be closed in a room with no obvious exits. That sends me off the deep end. This all started in my 30s. I was raised in a happy 2-parent home. My childhood and adolescent years were normal and a lot of fun. I always had a great attitude, and I don't remember being sad a day in my life. I spoke with a therapist for a season, and he believes it is the result of a traumatic experience, or PTSD. At that time, I had no memory of that night in 1966. I have recently tried to look Doug up, but I have no way to know where life took that kid. I'll keep looking. Maybe he has more answers than I do. I started hunting and fishing when I was 10 years old with an uncle here in the UK, and I've hunted and fished worldwide ever since. Being in the outdoors is me at my happiest, even if I don't get anything. I enjoy stalking deer, working the land, and being selective as to what I harvest. Everything I harvest is for the pot, except for the foxes and the rats. As a hunter, I believe in selective and ethical hunting, and when I do take a life, I always give the best I can for a quick, clean kill. I live in England, but most of my hunting was in Scotland on syndicate land leased from a tree plantation company. The plantation consisted of mature trees with fire breaks, clear fell, and new plantation with gravel tracks. We were allowed to have a static caravan on site. Americans call these camping trailers. The leased area was 1,500 acres, but next to this was a further 1,200 acres of woodland and farmland that was run by a local, and they shot for driven pheasant. The agreement with the gamekeeper was if we helped keep the foxes down on the chute by lamping at night, we would get an invite on the chute for the end of the season on Keeper's Day. One weekend in early October 2004, I arranged for myself and a friend to go deer stalking. I was all packed up and ready to go when my friend called me and said he couldn't come due to a family emergency. So it was just me and the dog, which was fine. I set off later than I was hoping for, and on the way up to Scotland, I got held up even further with roadworks. The 5-hour drive turned into 6 hours, and when I got to the trailer in the woodland, it was getting on for about 9:30 p.m., and I was losing light. There was not enough light left to start an evening stalk, so I made a meal, and I thought I would drive the plantation next door after midnight and see if I could nail some foxes whilst lamping. For all you rednecks out there, lamping is what we call shining or spotlighting, but he's doing it legally for foxes and predators, which is cool. We can't even do that. We can't even shine a light in a field at night, and the game warden will be on us like white on rice. But anyway, I digress. It's shining for all the rednecks. Just after midnight, I put the dog in the back of the Land Rover, set the spotting lamp up, and headed off with my 243. I arrived at the gate of the plantation and unlocked the gate, and I drove in. It was strange because I remember a funny feeling when I opened the gate. I wasn't sure what it was, but something didn't feel right. I drove along the mature woodland, and I looked down a fire break and noticed a bright light in the sky. It was very bright. I thought it was a satellite off in the sky. This was looking out the right side of my car at my 3 o'clock. I carried on past the mature trees and I turned right down a track that opened on some clear fell. I expected to see the light in front of me, but it was still at 90 degrees to my right, which was strange. I carried down the track for about 300 to 400 yards and I stopped. I looked at the light and it was still there, just hanging in the sky. I put my Zeiss binoculars on it and it was hard to look at due to the brightness. The thing was a bright silver. It looked like a cylinder on its end, like you would put a Coke can on a table. I put the rangefinder on it and it was 650 yards from me. It must have been 25 feet long and maybe 10 feet in diameter and hanging about 200 feet off the ground. I could see the trees illuminated by its brightness below. I carried on down the track and I turned right again. I was now driving behind it. I stopped and put the rangefinder on it again and it was now at 500 yards. This thing just hung there. I don't know what it was, but it made no noise and it didn't seem to move. I was mesmerized by it. Fear took over and I thought it best to move along. I floored it down the track. The road curved at the end and joined the original track that I came in on. I looked out the window and it was still hanging there. I had driven all the way around it, and it was always on the right side of the vehicle. I drove back to my syndicate area and I went to bed in the caravan. In the morning, I drove to the next door plantation again about 9 a.m. and I looked at the area again and saw no sign of it. I drove the same route and stopped in the same places and I never saw anything strange. A few months later, I told a friend about it, and after he finished laughing at me and saying it was the moon or a planet, he asked me why I didn't go closer to it or why I didn't take a shot at it with my rifle. At the time, that never occurred to me to even think of doing that, and in hindsight, I wouldn't have done so anyway. It's kind of drummed into me always to know what I'm shooting at and never to aim or discharge a rifle above a backstop. To this day, I don't know what it was. Primeval fear kept me from getting closer and told me to leave, and I think a deep unknown sixth sense told me something wasn't right when I arrived. I don't know if it was my eyes playing tricks, but I did get hits with the rangefinder, so this thing must have been solid and reflective. It seemed to emit a light, but it didn't have any lights. I've never seen anything like it again, nor do I really want to. It would be interesting if any of your followers have encountered anything that fits this description. Paul's got another thing he wanted to share, and I thought this was really good, just as good as his story. And here's what he writes. I wanted to give you one more short story that isn't a Bigfoot story, and it's not really a UFO story. This is about people who tell about what they have seen. I've noticed the amount of decent people who are ridiculed for telling the truth about what they saw, regardless of whether it can be explained or not. A lot of these people are well-respected, professional people who have their lives really affected by simply telling the truth, and that's what this story is about. Many years ago, I used to shoot wildfowl and game with a really nice guy. He had a great sense of humor, and the banter that he gave and was able to take was legendary. He worked for a local farmer and also was a part-time truck driver, and he worked for various haul firms in the southeast of the United Kingdom. He was ex-Army and served with his original regiment in Germany and Northern Ireland. Then needed more of a challenge and went for the parachute regiment. You have to be a tough bastard to get in that also, and you also have to be a bit mad. This was in the early 1980s. In 1982, he found himself on the way to the South Atlantic on a troop ship with his regiment in May of 1982 and found himself in full combat at Goose Green during the Falklands War. After he left the Army, he returned back to rural life, settled down and married, and they had a child. He was well known in the community and very well liked, and was the kind of guy who would help anyone out. Over a couple of beers one evening, he told me this story and how it affected his life, his work, and his marriage. In the summertime in the late 1980s, he was trucking freshly harvested peas with another guy in another truck. It was early morning and they were driving through a rural area in Suffolk and heading for a pea processing factory. As they drove down the quiet country roads, the sun started to rise, and in the pink and blue sky they saw two black triangles. They seemed to just hang silhouetted in the sky. He drew them and they were isosceles triangles. He said you could even see the heat haze coming off of them. He got on his CB to the other driver and said, "Do you see them? What the hell are they?" The other driver said, "Screw this," and they both floored the trucks and didn't stop until they reached the truck stop 20 miles away. He said they both felt shook up and told other truckers what they had seen. This was a big mistake. At no point did they ever say UFO or spaceship or aliens. They just described what they had seen in the sky that morning, and they received a fair amount of ridicule, and it didn't stop there. It spread like wildfire, and it never ended. They both were accused of drinking on the job and being mentally unbalanced. They lost work through the ordeal. They just weren't hired by any of the haulage companies. Every time he went into town, someone would draw an alien face on his car in the dust or whistle the Close Encounters theme. It was the same in the local pub. You would think that a tough guy like him could take it and that it could only go on for so long, but it stopped being banter or a joke and it simply turned into harassment. One day he had had enough and he punched one of his hecklers. Unfortunately, that got him his shotgun certificate revoked over it. I can't stress how constant it was. The other driver moved away because of the bullying also. In 1991, when the first Gulf War started, it suddenly became clear to him what he had actually seen. On television, the United States Air Force rolled out the F-117 stealth fighter. What he and the other driver had seen was these aircraft coming into land at an airbase in Suffolk. Even when he explained to people that's what he had seen, it never mattered and the harassment never stopped. I last saw him in the mid-1990s when he was running aid out for the United Nations to the Falklands War. I heard he met a Bosnian woman who was from Germany and moved out there after the war. He was a good friend and a great guy and really didn't deserve what he got for simply telling the truth. I grew up oblivious to the existence of Bigfoot until about 15 years ago. My grandparents live in a rural part of Mississippi. They live only a few minutes' drive from our house, and I visited them a lot. On a warm summer morning, I was awakened by a strange sound coming from the woods that surrounded their house. It was almost like shotgun blasts from a long way off, but the sounds were not random. They were in a series of reports over and over. Even as a kid, those sounds were peculiar to me, and I listened to them while I laid in the guest bed where I always slept. And I noticed the cadence and the rhythm of the sounds. The knocking eventually stopped, and in just a few seconds, I heard a series of hair-raising, bone-chilling roars blast out of the woods. That scared me. The knocks were one thing that interested me. The roar meant that it was a monster. The next day, I went home, but I didn't stop thinking about what I had heard. 2 weeks later, I was back at my grandfather's house to stay a while, and my 9-year-old mind got curious. So I picked up an aluminum baseball bat from the garage. I went out to the furthest tree to the creek, and I tore into that tree. I hit that tree several times so that the sound would carry, and I kept up a steady rhythm. I did this for 4 days, and I got no response from the woods. I began to think that I had been dreaming the event that I described earlier. On the 5th day, I got a response. The shotgun blast sounds started from a long way off. The knocks matched my cadence, and they started getting closer each day. I had to go home that last day, and I wondered what those noises meant. They were obviously answering my knocks. After church the next week, we went over to my grandparents' house for dinner. I didn't even have time to get outside before the knocks started up not 40 yards into the woods, and they were really loud. Fear washed over me, but I had to see where this was going. I chose a different tree closer to the house. I wasn't going closer to the loud knocks. I wanted to be close to the house, and I picked a tree at the edge of the yard, and I swung the bat at the tree, attempting to create the rhythm I had been doing the previous week. I never finished the series of knocks. A menacing roar came from the woods, and I heard something big moving, like it was intentionally letting me know that it was coming my way. It wasn't trying to be quiet. It sounded like heavy equipment pounding through the woods, and then it appeared right in front of me. I was 9 years old then and about 4'3" tall. The creature in front of me had to have been 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark matted hair, and it stood there heaving and staring at me. I was frozen with terror. This caught the attention of some dogs that lived at my grandparents' neighbor's house. They must have seen this thing step out into the clear or heard it. I heard them barking at first, and when I turned to look, they were running full speed across the field towards the creature and I. The beast turned to look at the dogs and instantly started running straight at them in the field. I could not believe how fast this thing was running. It closed the distance on those dogs in a flash, and when the dogs realized what was happening, they stomped on the brakes and headed straight back to their house. I never moved. The beast turned back towards me, and just as fast as he left, he was back right in front of me. Rage was all I could see in his face. I don't know if it realized my fear or took into account that I was just a kid, and maybe it was confused. But in a remarkable turn of events, its facial expression began to soften. Its brow raised, and I could see its eyes looking right at me. And with a slow movement of its arm and hand, it motioned for me to head back to the house. I walked slowly backwards the distance to the house, and I went inside. I stayed with my grandparents that whole week, but I never went outside other than to try to get the house dog outside to use the restroom. The dog was always nervous and would not go outside. She would use the carpet next to the window. She knew something was out there. For the next 3 nights, I heard those knocks, and occasionally I would hear a distant roar, and I didn't sleep well for all those days. If I remember right, it was the 4th night that I didn't hear anything from the woods. No knocks, no screaming from the dark woods. I got a decent night's sleep that night. As abruptly as the sounds and encounters had started, they stopped. Joy, the dog, started going outside again. I became more at ease just being out, and things seemed to settle down for the rest of the week that I was there. I went home with a memory that I would take with me the rest of my life. It is several years later at the time of this writing, and to my knowledge, nothing else has occurred on my grandfather's property.